This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
Well, hello there, Lewis Goodall sitting in for the great James O'Brien here on LBC. All this week from 10 till 1. And I've got some bad news for some of you, and I've doubtless know that this will not be the way that you want to start your February. I know that this will not be the sort of thing that perhaps particularly in this slot of all slots people want to hear, but I think it is important to do so, and that is this. It has finally happened, as I was saying there just before the news. We knew it probably was going to happen, that there was going to be a crossover point, and I'm going to caveat everything I say today on the basis, of course, this is just one poll, but this is a poll which is the gold standard of polling, which is a YouGov poll. You might have seen, particularly if you're on the dark recesses of the unfortunate sewer that is Twitter these days, lots of little fake polls or polls that are done by, very disreputable or certainly without much credibility polling companies and so on. A YouGov poll published yesterday evening, which shows that for the first time, Reform, led of course by Nigel Farage, is now topping a national poll in Britain for a Westminster voting intention. It's very, very, very unusual. 25%, Labour 24%, Tories on 21%. It used to be, of course, that Reform, Brexit, UKIP, People's Front of Judea, Judean People's Front, whichever one it happened to be, used to do well and come top of national polls at European parliamentary elections. That happened in each and every one since 2009 onwards, but not, 2014 onwards, I should say, but not for Westminster voting intention. That, of course, has been the preserve, pretty much the duopoly of the Labour and Conservative parties since the dawn of modern parliamentary democracy in the early 20th century, with a couple of exceptions now and again with parties like the SDP. So, of course, if this were to become a trend, and we can also say it's still within a margin of error, 25 to 24, Labour's polling position is more robust than it might seem in some ways. But if it were to become a trend, it is something very different. It changes the constellation, the parameters of politics. And I know that there will be people listening to this who get very frustrated with the media on this. And to some extent, I share your frustration, which is you say, well, hang on a minute. They've only got 4 or 5 MPs. Why is it that they get so much airtime? Why do we not give the Greens more airtime? Why do we not give the Lib Dems more airtime? Now, my response to that would be, certainly on the shows that I'm involved with, we do. And there is certainly true that the media is almost calibrated to absorb the kind of crack cocaine of the hard right populist rise story. It's something that a lot of the media wants to report on. I agree with you about that. But that doesn't mean you can ignore it, because it's not all media confection. And the reason I know it's not all media confection is because it isn't just happening in Britain. If Britain were an isolated example, then of course you could say, well, this is a media creation, or this is something to do with the jaundiced way that the right-wing media in this country operates. But of course, it is not. The story of the last couple of years of politics across the West has been the rise of these hard right, radical right, sometimes far right forces, and the distinction between those terms is important, and I want to get onto that later in the show because too often they're confused or just sort of thrown around. But it is happening everywhere. France, Italy, United States, Spain, Portugal, the Scandinavian countries, the model in many ways of modern social democracy happening in the Scandinavian countries as well. And of course Germany, where later this month we will have an election, early German parliamentary elections. And the thing that I want to talk to you about today is how mainstream parties of the centre-left or centre-right take these populists, the hard right, whatever you want to call them, on. Because there aren't many successful cases right now of many parties around the world doing so. There are roughly 2 models available to you. You either have the old cordon sanitaire, the iron wall, where centre-right parties in particular say, no, we're having nothing to do with these people. Maybe they're racist, maybe they're anti-institutionalists, maybe they dabble in dark forces, maybe they're conspiratorialists, like whatever it happens to be. We will not deal with them. That certainly historically has been the German approach, historically in France as well. And then in some other countries, they start to ape them. They start to emulate them. They use their language. They use their policies. They adopt the things that they want to happen to try and court the voters that they are suddenly appealing to. You could argue the British Conservative Party has very much gone down that route. In fact, has basically been following the Pied Piper of Nigel Farage wherever he has happened to go and wherever he's happened to be. And what's interesting about what's happening in Germany right now, with the German Conservative leader, the leader of the CDU, the centre-right party, roughly the equivalent of the Conservative Party here, Friedrich Merz, who's widely expected to become the German Chancellor after the elections. He has gone on, during the course of this election campaign, a bit of a journey a bit of a transformation. He's started to try to say he doesn't want to work with the AfD, the hard right force, some would say far right force in Germany. But he has started to very much adopt their language and indeed introduce things in the German parliament which they want. And indeed, he has given an uncompromising speech in the last 24 hours, saying that while he's confident the CDU will win the 23rd of February vote with a very good result, he has been accused, after a wave of protests, accused of breaching the time-honoured firewall between the far right and the centrists. He says he will not work with the far right. And yet increasingly in his language and his attitude and his policies, he is accused of aping them. And I want to talk to you about how it is, assuming we want to fight these people, assuming we think that these people are bad people, maybe you don't, maybe you want to phone in and say that actually you're glad that they're articulating something that you want in politics. But if you do, how is it best to fight them? Do you ape them or do you reject them? Do you try, if you can't beat them, join them? Or do you try and draw lines in the sand? How do we take on the populists? 0345 6060973, 0345 6060973. I'll give you more of my thoughts on that a little bit later on. First, let's talk to Annette Dittert, senior correspondent at ARD London, who, of course, is German herself, will be following all of these things very closely and knows the British political situation as well. Annette, Merz has been on a bit of a journey of late, hasn't he?
I mean, he's basically broken a massive taboo, which is even more morally important in a way to many Germans in Germany with the history we had last week by not only pandering to the narrative of the far right, but also basically cooperating with them. Maybe I have to just go one step back to understand what happened last week in this, rather momentous week for German politics that changed a lot of how politicians now will work with each other. What Merz did, the centrist conservative opposition leader, who is not a nationalist, who's not a populist, he's not a far right, so not a far right, sort of doesn't want to cooperate or work with the far right. What he did was, after a knife attack, a horrific attack by an asylum seeker from Afghanistan, the debate around migration was obviously reignited, and mostly, of course, by the AfD, the hard right party, I would say. The AfD has been classified as extremist by the German domestic intelligence services, parts of them. So what did Merz do? He proposed legislation that would permanently end freedom of movement and close Germany's borders. And then suggesting that if the Greens and the Social Democrats, the democratic centrist parties, wouldn't vote for that, he would tolerate the AfD voting for him. So that was breaking a massive taboo that you would not, and he promised that only 4 weeks before that centrist parties would not let themselves be tolerated by the hard right, by the AfD. And that caused a massive uproar in Germany. We had 160,000 people only in Berlin demonstrating against that on Sunday, and many, many more in other cities. Of course, Annette, what Merz is saying, and what others who advocate what he's doing is saying, is that he is responding, that someone has to respond to the fact that the AfD is generating such support. And that there has, in particular, been, widespread revulsion, entirely understandably in Germany, after a series of attacks that have been committed by people who are either asylum seekers or whatever they happen to be, and that someone has to speak to that anxiety, and that's what he's doing. Of course, somebody has to not only speak to that anxieties, but also there is a massive problem with immigration in Germany, because the Länder, the federal governments are completely overwhelmed. There is way too little resources and money to take care of these people. There is a massive problem. But it's a problem that can only be solved if the centrist parties cooperate, and also if you cooperate within the EU. The problem with Merz's suggestion is he hasn't only pandered to the AfD by saying Germany is an unsafe country, we have to do something now, which was a knee-jerk reaction because Germany is not an unsafe reaction. So he's mirrored the language of the AfD, which is a problem because he normalizes it. The second problem with his acts last week, or with the way he proceeded, was this is to say we will close our borders is dynamite at the foundation of the EU. he cannot just do pushbacks without irritating all the other countries in the EU. We have Schengen, that is freedom of movement within the EU. So if all the other countries say, okay, we'll close our borders now as well, then what? This is also against EU law and partly against German law. It's a bit like Rwanda. It's something he will not be able to fulfill. And that's the biggest problem for me. If he wins this election, he will win it probably by 30%. He's not the president of the US, so he will have to form a coalition. He won't find a coalition within the centrist spectrum that will do this kind of policy with him. The Social Democrats have said this is nonsense. This will end up in courts. This is against EU law. And he can't rule on his own, although he pretends, he just plays the mini Trump at the moment. He says, on day one, I will close the borders. He can't do that. So what will that lead to? That will lead to further erosion of trust, because he will not be able to do any of that, what he's promising now. So at the end of the day, after the elections, he will basically enforce the narrative that the mainstream can't deliver. And then what? And also, by having attacked the centrist parties so much and so viciously over the last week, I can't see how they will be able to form a stable coalition after February 23rd. And Merz will have to form a coalition. So I think this has been a knee-jerk emotional reaction. He thinks this will help him because he has to somehow take up the stories of the AfD. But I think the way he did it was very pointless and will spectacularly backfire.
And finally, talk to me about the other very, very weird and unexpected elements of all of this, and person who is involved in all of this, who is, of course, Elon Musk, who, of course, is doing pretty extraordinary things with the American federal government at the moment. We're going to be talking about that later in the show. But also who has been very much endorsing and indeed addressing the AfD and encouraging Germans to move on from their past.
Yes, that was also really interesting. I mean, we have to say here that Elon Musk isn't that big an influence like here. It's partly a language thing. Not every German does speak English, although it sometimes seems like that in Berlin. So this has given the AfD a massive flush of confidence and pushed the leader of the AfD, Alice Weidel, to be even more extremist and openly now support the concept of remigration, which means that the AfD wants to even deport German passport holders who have an immigration background. That came after her talk online with Elon Musk. So this has certainly had an influence and has given the AfD a massive flush of confidence. But it's not as big a factor as it is here.
And just very, very briefly now, how radical are the AfD, not just in terms of German politics, but objectively in terms of the politics of Europe right now?
They're extremely radical. I would say they are one of the most extremist hard-right parties in Europe, next to the Austrian Freedom Party. They are openly anti-EU. The concept of remigration is something most of the other far-right parties in Europe would not share. They are pro-Putin. They do not want to support Ukraine anymore. And they have been even too extreme for the likes of Marine Le Pen, who has thrown them out of their European group because she said they are too extremist, too toxic. So we're looking at one of the most extremist far-right parties or hard-right parties in Europe here.
Annette Dittert there, senior correspondent at ARD London, giving us her assessment and analysis of exactly who the AfD are, really the parable of what Friedrich Merz, the leader of the German Conservative Party, the CDU, is doing. And that's what I want to talk to you on the show today. Why is it that the populist, hard-right, far-right forces, and I'm going to talk in a minute about kind of the difference between those two things, because I say they get lazily kind of just sort of banded together. But what we can say is there is this force which is breaking through in country after country after country across the West. And I think those German elections could really be a political earthquake in a couple of weeks' time. And so there are two questions that I want to try and get to the bottom of and get your thoughts on. And I've got my own thoughts, but I certainly don't have all of the answers. One, why is it happening? Why is it happening so universally? And also, as a sort of 1B on this essay question, as 1B, why is it happening so much on the right, Because you could have economic populism and forces, radical forces, a politics of insurgency on the left. We saw quite a bit of that in the last decade. People like Podemos in Spain or Jeremy Corbyn within the Labour Party here. Bernie Sanders in the United States. There was a real moment of kind of left-wing populism and energy. That all seems to have gone completely, seems to have dissipated. And it's all happening on the right, time after time after time. Why is that? What is the reason for that? And two, assuming we want to stop it, and there will be people out there I know who don't, they welcome it. But how do you do so? Because right now, in country after country, in the laboratories of democracy that is Europe, all of these little experiments going on in country after country, no one seems to be succeeding. Whether you ape them or you eschew them, whether you have them at arm's length or you hold them close, it doesn't seem to be stopping the rise. Something more fundamental is going on. So how do you do it? 0345 6060973 0345 6060973. Talking about this, as I say, on the day, on the 24 hours anyway, when Reform overtakes Labour and leads a national opinion poll for the first time. You're listening to Lewis Goodall here on LBC, sitting in for James O'Brien. The time is 10:19.
James O'Brien on LBC.
Time is 10:21. Before we go to Toby in Bristol, I do think it's important we define our terms a little bit here. Because, as I say, you can sort of throw around, centre-right, hard-right, far-right, and they are really different. And I think it is a fair challenge. People often, when people like me are talking about this and sometimes, worrying about the rise of these forces, people turn around and say, well, what do you mean far-right, hard-right? You're just someone who's concerned about immigration or whatever it happens to be. And I think it is a fair challenge. So let me just briefly try and sort of set out what I think is the main difference. Look, centre-right, I think it's fair to say, some of it is about mindset. Some of it is about how these forces approach politics, right? So one thing is just about disposition. So someone on the centre-right is by definition going to be more open to compromise, to accepting that they might not get everything that they want, to have a kind of accommodation with more liberal forces. And I think it's fair to say that, when we think about traditional centre-right figures, so someone like, Rishi Sunak might be like that, Emmanuel Macron might be more like that, Angela Merkel is clearly more like that, Mitt Romney on certain issues in the American context would be more like that. So some of it is about that. Someone on the hard right is going to be far more uncompromising about all of those things, particularly with regards to immigration, to sovereignty. They will be more nationalist, all of that sort of thing. And I think that is another key difference. Or let's think about the difference on immigration between someone on the centre right, I would say, and someone who is on the hard right or even far right. Someone who is on the hard right on immigration, which is the issue which gives so much of this most saliency, right? Someone who is on the hard right or the radical right would say, in a way that someone on the centre right would not, that there is something almost inalienable about people coming here, something that is irreconcilable about them. Maybe it's their religion, maybe on the furthest right might even be their race. There is something irreconcilable about that and the country they're coming to. Enoch Powell is the best example of this. Enoch Powell's basic point, everyone always obsesses about the language he uses and about the very insulting terms he uses, which were appalling. But his basic argument was a centerpiece of nationalism and hard right thinking, which is that the people who were coming to Britain in the 1960s, largely from South Asia and other places like that at the time, that there was something about them which never could be British. They could never reconcile themselves. They could never truly be part of this country because they could never subscribe or understand this country's national character. Now, that is a view which has actually become more and more commonplace on the right in recent years. It is now actually, I would say, reasonably mainstream among forces on the right. It's certainly at the centre of a lot of the thinking with Trump in the United States. And someone on the centre right just would not believe that, and they would not accept that. And then you've got the far right, and I think this is very particular, and I actually wouldn't describe someone like Marine Le Pen or someone actually these days as far right, because I think far right has a very particular dimension to it, which is that they reject democracy and they are willing to overthrow democratic institutions in order to get what they want. In that sense, to be honest, actually Trump and the forces around Trump could certainly have been described as far right, certainly around the time of January the 6th, because that is precisely what happened. So I think that there is a real difference and in terms of the politics that we're seeing emerge now and the politics that we have come to know and known for the last few decades. And that is why it's worth covering and talking about. Let's talk to, and you might disagree with those definitions, and by all means, tell me if you do. Let's talk to Toby, who is in Bristol. Toby.
Good morning, Lewis.
Good morning.
Yes, I can't disagree with what you're saying. I think some of the things that have come up, we have to bear in mind that I think a large driver of it was the banking crash of 2008, which means we've now had 17 years of restrictive economic, basically, damage. And it's a breeding ground for people who like the flavour of populism. And people like Trump, people like Farage, people like the AFD, feed on this idea, one of fear of othering. I'm a dual citizen now because of Brexit. I'm now German-British, and that was because my father, who was on the timber transport in the Second World War, had his citizenship removed. And I'm very, very aware of what's going on in Germany, even though I can't vote in their election because they haven't figured out how to deal with me yet. But equally, I think that it's that idea that populism gives you easy answers to really difficult things. And I think that is the central failure of left-wing progressive politics. And I did feel, I was a primary school teacher, I did feel during the mid-2000s when Labour were pumping money into the NHS and to schools and to other services, that people could see why it was that society was changing. The problem we've got now is that what Starmer is particularly inept at doing, and I'm a Labour voter and I would like to be in the EU tomorrow given the choice, but Starmer is particularly failing on is that any articulation of the reason that we're doing these difficult things is because of what happened before. And that message is not getting across. The other thing I think that's happening is the fracturing of media. So what you've got is this narrow casting, which I know you're very, very aware of, especially in America, but here where you just get fed a diet of what you want to see and an algorithm feeds you it. So it feeds that fear of what's going on around you in society. And I think unless Labour can somehow, and parties in Germany as well, can somehow figure out a way of getting the message across, then this is why we're seeing this rise. And as disgusting as I find it, I can understand why. I can't give you a simple answer as to how we fix it, but I don't think it is simple, because that's the whole point of how populism works.
Yeah, I think, and I want to talk a little bit in a minute, Toby, about exactly the point you identified, which is the power of communication. Because whatever you think about populist, hard right, etc., whatever you want to call it, they have a message. They have something to say, something that's easy to understand. Now, it may be wrong, it may be dishonest at times, but it is something which resonates. And I think that you put your finger exactly on the point, which is that, certainly since 2008, it's felt, let's talk about, I don't know, the centre, sort of the liberal left. Very often it's felt as if they have nothing to say. There's no message that they're trying to get across. Oh, I think we've lost Toby there. Well, anyway, I'm going to put that I'm going to put that message out there. I think Toby is precisely right, which is and I was going to come on to this, but let's talk about it now since Toby had brought it up. You cannot blame, if you're sat here and you hate the sort of forces that we're talking about, you dislike them, you think they're dangerous, that's fine. And of course you're entitled to that view, and parts of it I might subscribe to personally. But ultimately, you can't blame a political force for existing. It's a democratic marketplace. And if it is that the forces for want of a better expression, let's call it centre-left, whatever, liberal left, whatever you want to call it, are unable to rally and cohere around an effective message, an effective rejoinder, an effective rebuttal to these forces, then no wonder they win. I mean, my problem right now, I think if I were Starmer, the thing I would be most worried about is that, and the thing I'm surprised that doesn't seem to have been internalised more, Starmer's entire pitch, let's take it to the British example here, Starmer's entire pitch is that he is a politician who does, and he doesn't necessarily need to say. He shows, he doesn't tell. He's someone who believes in results. He's someone who believes in deliverism. He believes, and Morgan McSweeney, his chief advisor, believe that if the state can be shown to be improving people's lives in a real and tangible way, then they will turn away from these dark forces and return to the mainstream. I think it's a lovely idea, and I'd love to believe that it were true. Of course, it actually requires you to deliver these things, but let's, for the sake of argument, think that you can. I'm just not sure it's right. I'm not sure in the 21st century, in the multiplicity media world, where everyone is fragmented, where everyone is getting their own particular feed, I think it is far easier. People won't, even if they experience these things, even if life actually does get better, if they don't see it on their phone rather than reality, if they don't feel it rather than know it, then it may make no difference at all, that you may not affect voting intention at all. And the reason I say that, look at the United States. Look what happened in 2024 in lots and lots of ways. In previous generations, the Biden economy would have been hailed. Yes, there were inflation problems, but it's nonetheless, Biden did not get the return, the political return on what he had created. And nor did he in terms of the legislation he achieved. And why? Because Trump and his opponents, the populists, whatever you want to call them, they flood the zone. They know the importance of communications. They know that if you need to be everywhere, anywhere, all at once. Bam, bam, bam. Narrative, narrative, narrative. Strength, strength, strength. That's why Trump is signing executive orders every day of the week in a stadium with all of his people around him. Not because half the time these executive orders even do anything. It's just performative. But he knows the message he's sending. Strength, 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 action, action, action. Donald Trump and the radical right around the world get and understand the modern media environment in a way that the centre-left centrists simply do not. They're not at the races. They're not playing the same game. I want to talk to you a little bit more about all of this and why it is that populists, the right wing, the far right, whatever you want to call them, are on the rise everywhere at the moment. And what it is that we could do, if you want to change it. 0345 6060 973, 0345 6060 973. Lots more to come on the show today. Let's first, though, at 10:32, let's get the very latest LBC News headlines with Thomas Watts.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It's 10:35. Few of your messages here. Michael says, sorry for the long message here. Last two comparable elections without candidates being withdrawn to Brexit, though, etc. Farage with UKIP in 2015 got 3.9 million. Now Farage with Reform UK, he got 4.1 million in 2024. Yes, they picked up 5 ex-Tory seats, but they take and Labour seats, but take away the wall-to-wall positive media coverage, making them feel there is some huge Reform UK wave and a movement going on, then they would be nowhere. Mike, I mean, this is a really interesting question, and it goes to the heart of what we were saying at the top, which is this how much is the media responsible for this? And yes, of course there's a media element to it. And like I say, certainly in Britain, where the press is geared towards the right, they're very keen on the story around Farage. Of course they are. And he's certainly benefited from that. I would also say this, and because it's an interesting thought experiment, isn't it, is to, the Greens got a similar number of seats at the election, but they're not enjoying a surge in the polls. They've gone up a bit, but not nearly as much as Farage and Reform has done. And you've got to sort of say, well, why is that? And of course, one of the reasons is the media element. The media are far less sympathetic to the Greens. Indeed, they're, generally speaking, highly hostile to them. So yeah, that's true. But it is also about how you approach politics. And Farage, to his credit, is better at understanding the media game of politics in a way that the Greens are not and do not. And so, actually, this is what I'm saying. Progressive parties, insurgent parties, have to be better at understanding the media environment and getting attention in an era where there is just a massive political fight for eyeballs at all times. You have to be expert at securing those eyeballs. We are in the attention economy as much as we are any other type of economy. Let's talk to Brian, who is in Toddington. Brian.
Good morning, nervous first-time caller.
Nothing to be nervous about here, Brian. All very friendly.
I am nearly 60, 58 years of age, been a lifelong Tory supporter, never voted anything else, and I always vote. At the next election, even though I do not like Nigel Farage, I'll probably vote for him because he appears to be the person that is going to do what most working people want, and that is start looking after the English people. We've got hospitals falling apart, not enough doctors, nurses, schools falling apart, roads falling apart, not enough houses. that uncontrolled immigration is starting. I'm not about stopping immigration. The country needs migrants, so I accept that. Some of the best people I work with are foreign nationals. But mass uncontrolled migration between 500,000 and 1 million people pound a year, not pound, 1 million people a year, coming into the country when we ain't got enough homes for our own people.
Of course, Brian, in order to build those homes, we'll probably need migrants because we don't have enough people, we don't have enough builders and plasterers and all the rest of it. The housing sector have been very clear about that.
And I'm not on about stopping migration. No one in their right mind wants to stop migration, even thinks it can be stopped. I'm on about mass uncontrolled migration. I keep getting called far right. I'm not. I'm right wing, always have been. I'm a Tory. But the more we get called the far right, extreme right, the more right we go.
Because I get that, Brian.
Our voice isn't being heard.
I get that, Brian, and that is why I was really keen to try and find the terms, because it isn't helpful to anyone if these things are just bandied around. But I suppose the point is, you talk about the idea that migration is uncontrolled. Well, it's high. There's no two ways about that. It's an historic high. It's come down a bit, but it's still very, very high. 600, 700,000 a year net. But it is being controlled. We're not in the EU anymore. These are all people, with the exception of about 30,000 or so who come across the channel illegally. But that's obviously a small percentage. Then it is controlled. We've allowed these people in.
Then it's controlled at too high a number. When people like me, and I'm just a normal working man, see 500,000. We'll leave the number at 500,000 people a year, right? And we know it's more. 10 years, that's 5 million. How many have come in the last 10 years? We haven't got enough homes already. I'm a builder. I want to build more houses. It's how I earn my crust. But we haven't got that now. We need to cut it right down to tens of thousands, possibly.
But of that, you talk about that, of that 500,000, of course, Brian, around 200,000 plus, up to 300,000 a year are students. Would you consider those to be migrants?
If they're coming as students to do their student visa and then either stay legally or go back to their country of origin, no, I would not class that.
See, this is
every child needs an education.
See, Brian, I think this is a really interesting point, because I think a lot of people, it's as you know, this is a very polarised debate and people are very passionate about it, as you are. But I actually think that one of the big problems with it is, with the numbers as we currently constitute it, is that we do include students in it. And that's 200,000 to 300,000 people, which pushes that number up, which sounds, I agree with you, pretty scary, 600, 700,000. Let's call it 500,000 on average. But if you take those away, suddenly you're down at 200, 300,000, which you might say is still too many. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But I think most people on all sides of this debate actually wouldn't regard students as migrants in the traditional sense.
Well, most students are actually putting into the economy. They pay for their
and they help our universities, and they help our universities to stay afloat because they pay a fortune often in fees.
Yeah, and the local environments around at the shops, and they will get it. But again, a lot of the big things. I work on different sites. I work all over the country because of what I do, and we have conversations all the time. There, most of the people I talk to are not far right. They're not extreme right. They are. Right, I like to call myself a nationalist. Right, I love the country I was born in, and I want it to be a good place to live. But it's not a good place to live now. There isn't enough hospitals. There's not enough houses. We need to sort out our own house before we can sort out other people's houses.
All right,
and the boats are a big problem coming in. Now, I'm not saying a lot of them are not proper asylum seekers. I genuinely feel sorry for them, but most of them, and you can Google it because I have, they're men. Over 60% of young men aged between 20 and 40. If I was leaving this country, it was unsafe. I would not leave my wife and daughter here. I'd be sending them, and I'd be staying.
All right, Brian, grateful to you. I've interviewed a lot of those people out in the camps in northern France. I'm sure there are economic migrants there. There are people, I would say, gently 21, there who are absolutely, I think, definitely asylum seekers, refugees. Obviously, there's a question about how many we can let in, but we can't deny that those people exist. Nick is in Ilford. Nick.
Hi, Lewis. Just a quick point before I make my main point. It's interesting that you brought up students. I don't think a lot of people have issue with the students. they have an issue with the amount of dependents that they bring with them, which is something like 2 to 3 times the number of actual students.
It's been clamped down on now, but yes, historically there's been perhaps a problem over that.
So to my main point, the reason you're seeing a rise in what you would call the far right or the extreme right or whatever you want to call them is because they haven't been listened to by the mainstream parties. Most people, I believe, voted Brexit to reduce immigration and get control. We got control, brilliant. And what did people get? Mass immigration by the Tory party, like in the millions. And I understand that some of them figures include, Ukrainians and stuff, but this has gone on for years. Up until Tony Blair, there wasn't a big problem with people's thoughts around immigration in this country. It was around a 4th or 5th on the things they were worried about. That changed with the immigration levels.
Problem is, Nick, is that yes, I mean, you're right. I mean, we are in a different sort of environment these days, but we're not alone in that. I mean, most Western countries have turned towards higher immigration models for a simple reason, which is that our societies have aged, our labour pool has reduced, COVID in particular, and it's a whole separate debate, but COVID in particular has reduced the labour force for all sorts of different reasons. And so in that circumstance, what happened, in particular in the period after 2020 to 2021, and politicians, I think one of the problems is politicians aren't straight with the public about this, and they do it on the sly, hoping no one notices, but of course everybody does. They don't turn around and say, right, we need these people for this reason and this reason and that reason. We need it for social care, we need it for building, whatever it happens to be. It just happens, but we did need a lot of those people, because there would have been trade-offs elsewhere.
Well, that's true, Lewis, but people do understand it. I mean, it's interesting you're talking about 2021. This problem was going on a long time before that. Listen, a good example of that is something you were talking about to the last call about we need tradesmen. We do. So you know what? Instead of the 1 million or the 600,000 people that we've got coming in, you bring in 20, 30,000 people, make half of them tradesmen and get those houses built. We've got a Labour Party that's talking about building 5,000 houses a week, which will literally only cope with the immigration. So people aren't stupid. They can look at the figures and go, we're being lied to. We're not being told the truth. And if the truth is higher immigration for a reason, give that reason.
Well, I agree with that. Yep.
We're being lied to, and people don't believe it, so they're not going to vote for mainstream parties. And you're seeing that across Europe. That's why you're seeing this swing. It's something I'm a centrist. It's something I've been worried about for a long time. Listen to us, or we're going to see far right. You talk far right, genuinely far right parties getting in that none of us like, but are actually doing the things that we want them.
Let's just leave, Nick, very briefly, leaving immigration to one side. Is that the main reason you think, in terms of not being listened to, or are there other things as well?
We're not being listened to. Because
but like what else? What else?
Well, for me, when we look at services, housing, NHS, literally every aspect of life, if we talk about the UK, is being affected by the numbers. Because
I understand. I've heard you on immigration. I'm just wondering, is there something else that you feel, when you say we're not being listened to, is there other areas that you feel we're not being listened to, or is it all just come down to immigration?
Well, we're not being listened to on housing. I mean, I believe if Labour genuinely wanted to sort the housing issues out, it would be right. Let's have some government lending, which we know we don't like lending, but if it's done for the right reasons, we need a mass house building scheme like we did.
But who's going to? But all of the various different consumer bodies or confederation of builders and so on have made clear that we don't have enough builders to build the houses that we've currently got on slate. So we're going to need some more people then, aren't we? Where we're going to get them from?
But I've already tackled that one. People wouldn't mind immigration if we had people, if we had tradesmen coming in to do work that was essential to make this country better. People wouldn't have a problem. I mean,
but that does happen now.
The big issue for me was they are, but they're not bothered when we need it. We're seeing a lot of immigration that we don't need.
Like what? For what?
Well, I've already told that already about the students.
But that actually stopped. But that stopped in January 2024. So that stopped.
Well, it will eventually, but it's been going on for a long time.
It's stopped now.
And you're seeing it also with workers that come here bringing dependents.
Well, that's also been much clamped down upon.
It's been clamped down, but it hasn't been stopped. I think if we're going to say to someone, here's a visa for 5 years, you can come on your own.
But what if that person is, say, we want someone who's got if they're a high-tech engineer working in a tech firm, but they say, right, well, I'll leave California, but I've got to bring my wife and kids. You'd say no?
we look somewhere else
but often there's a very limited number of these people. I mean, we want to be a place for high investment and business,
don't we? Well, I would say if you're talking about technology, no, there's a lot of it around the world. Whether you're talking about the Philippines, India, America, there's a lot going around.
Brilliant people. There aren't that many.
They are brilliant people, but there are also a lot of these people that, because of the kind of work they do, can work remotely.
What about social care? We've got crying out for these social care workers.
Well, I've got an answer to that. Do you know what? We need to start paying the wages. I live in a care home. I'm disabled. We start paying wages to the workers that gets Brits doing the jobs that they won't do at the moment because
and a lot of those places will go bankrupt, or there'll be even higher costs for consumers, for people who are paying social care, which are already sky high. I mean, what I'm saying, Nick, I'm not saying that you're wrong. What I'm saying is there are trade-offs. You know, there will be costs if we went down the road that you're going on, and very often people almost pretend as if it's cost-free. That's the problem.
I can explain that. This is where we need parties that effectively explain that and say, if we pay more wages, there's going to be a trade-off. That trade-off will be potentially higher taxes, and it will affect you in these ways, but in other ways it will be better. And this is what will give us a higher wage economy that leads to growth. We've been stuck in this economy of low wages for so long, and everyone is suffering. And ultimately, people are paying for that. So we're paying, if we pay higher wages in the care homes, not so many people will be on universal credit, therefore those taxes will be lower. If you look at the housing benefit in this country, it's paid mainly to people in work, and that needs to change with a higher wage economy.
Nick in Ilford there. Respectful conversation, I think. Good to have Nick in Ilford. Look, I think where Nick and I can definitely agree, and I still think that in the heart of hearts, a lot of people who talk about this, they're not willing to engage with the trade-offs. But I would think definitely, one way or the other, one thing that politicians have not been willing to do, as Nick was saying there, on the mainstream, is to have a message about things like immigration and be straight with the public about why we need it, about why we need those people as opposed to training more people who are already here, the benefits of it, and so on. Because if what you do is you basically accept, which is what basically what, say, Kemi Badenoch and Robert Jenrick are doing right now. We haven't even talked about them. I mean, Tories 21% in the polls, astounding. And the national poll, when they're in opposition, amazing, extraordinary, almost unprecedented. If you basically just say, well, we're going to be just like them, we'll be like Reform. Well, then obviously the answer is, or the obvious next question is, well, why wouldn't we just vote for Reform? Why not just go full fat rather than semi-skimmed? You're listening to Lewis Goodall here on LBC. We'll continue this conversation for the next 10 minutes or so, and we'll also be turning to other matters as well, about mental health and about antidepressants and whether we're just medicating mental health a little bit too much. That's after 11. Time is 10:50.
James O'Brien on LBC.
Chris in Cardiff, he says, Lewis, I think there has been an international rise of this far-right rhetoric since Trump's last stint in power. He's given a voice to a group who have existed in the shadows, but who now have public form. The other issue we now see is the centre and left don't seem to have enough strength to push back. Chris, as I've already said, I agree. I think the centre and left, it doesn't know what it's arguing for, doesn't know what it's arguing about, doesn't know what the dividing lines are, doesn't have much sense of itself at the moment. What is the society it wants to defend? You can see the sort of society that the radical right want to build and want to create, and who they like and who are their people and who they're not. Very little sense by comparison of that from the left and centre left. I think that is one of the reasons you're right, that they're struggling. Rob is in Hayes. Rob.
Good morning, Lewis.
Morning.
How you doing?
Yeah, well, thank you. What have you got to say on this one?
Okay, I think that we're not quite hitting the nail on the head here. Right?
Okay.
What it is, the first thing that needs to happen is that everybody needs to feel that they got more money in their pockets.
Yep.
All right, that's the first thing.
Yep.
The second thing is that we've had, since 1979, I think we've only had like 12 and a half years of Labour government. Is that correct? Everything else has been talked
Since 1979, we've had, about now we're going on for like 13 and a half, now with the current lot, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. So everything else has been Tory.
Yep.
Okay. They have got to start taking responsibility for their actions of what's happened in this country. From the breaking down of the industrial north all the way down to austerity to right now. All right? The only time this conversation of immigration has never really reared its ugly head, all right, is the Tony Blair years. And the reason why was because people felt richer. People felt they got more money in their pockets. They're working, everything's fine. The National Health Service was at its highest ratings ever. So people never really complained. Schools were in good conditions, our roads were in good conditions, people were working, And that's where it is. And as for this conversation of we need to have a conversation about immigration, I was born in 1968, Lewis, not a million miles
Rivers
from you.
of blood.
Yeah, right. So, yeah, I was born in 1968 in West Bromwich.
Yeah.
Right? We have done nothing but talk about immigration.
I know. I love this idea about having a debate about immigration every week, every day.
That's right. So this thing of we need to have a conversation, it's never stopped. The only time it stopped was in the 90s. Why? Because people thought they got more money. Now, I don't want to put this on you. It's not personally your fault. But what really needs to happen here is that people in the media, on the TV, on Sunday mornings, instead of pandering to people so they get viewing figures, need to start asking the hard questions of certain people. What is it that you're about? What is it that you're going to do for this country? And don't talk about immigration. We want to know about jobs. This country includes everybody, Lewis. Everybody.
Yep.
Everybody that's here in this country, born here, whatever, they're here. They're here. They're us. They're our people.
Mm-hmm.
All we've got is politicians and a whole stream of them that come on our TVs that are just about dividing people. They're not about putting people together.
Rob, very, very eruditely put. Thank you very much indeed. Very, really interesting. And I think that, as he's saying, one thing I don't want to get into the media element of it again, because that's a whole other conversation, or needs more fleshing out, doesn't it? But I certainly think, look, the economic immiseration story is massive. We've had no increase in living standards for 20 years nearly. That's never happened, or it's not happened since the Napoleonic Wars. When historians look back, they'll see that and they'll say, well, that's obviously a big part of the reason, isn't it? Although, clearly not the only reason, because you've still got the same forces at work in the United States, and they have not had that. They have had dramatic increases in living standards over the last 10 years. Let's try and get Charles in from Bagshot before we go to the news. Charles.
Hi, thanks for taking my call.
Not at all.
One thing, the big advantage Farage had over the other parties, you don't really need to think a lot to support them. It doesn't require much thought or thinking, because they have very simplistic solutions to extremely complex problems. And I'm coming from someone that used to be in this cult. I used to listen to, what's his name, Alex Jones, and all of that nonsense.
Yeah. A well-known conspiracy theorist for people.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, I know, Farage is, the way you defeat Farage is you get him on the policy. Okay, how are you going to give us a policy? How are you going to do this? And when he's put flustered, he gets aggressive. He's very, very thin-skinned.
He can be
like
thin-skinned.
Trump.
Yep.
Yeah, I actually had got him. He was on phoning. I think it might have been to the station, and I called him when Farage was here, and I asked him, Nigel, are you still taking your EU pension? And he got very angry, very aggressive, and shut me down. So if you get him on a touchy subject, he can't deal with it. And you need to communicate. One of the best communicators I've known is like Ronald Reagan. I didn't like his policies, but he was a brilliant communicator.
Oh, yeah, of course. And you know, Charles, you know what Ronald Reagan's last speech in office was all about? Sorry, it's an unfair question. There's no reason you'd know in particular, but it is about immigration and about how positive immigration had been for the United States over decades. Honestly, if anyone is listening to this right now and has a spare 10 minutes, 15 minutes, just look up on YouTube, Ronald Reagan, final speech, immigration. It is well worth listening to. It is the sort of thing that would get him thrown out of the Republican Party today, and he would be considered an absolute woke, soft, lefty Democrat by comparison. So go and listen to that. It just shows how far politics has moved. Charles, really grateful to you. Really, really interesting set of conversations as well. I think that we've got to try and scratch the surface, go a bit deeper to try and understand, delve deep to try and understand these extraordinary tectonic political forces. Doubtless we'll be returning to it soon. We're going to have a real change of pace now, though, and go for something and talk about something which I think actually is another one of those conversations which should be had more. And this follows the parents of Thomas Kingston, who happens to be the husband of Prince and Princess Michael of Kent, warning about the side effects of depression after he took his own life. They're saying that the pills and the medication that he took were responsible, or likely responsible, and there isn't enough warning, enough pressure put on people, too much pressure put on people to always take antidepressants. Aren't we just over-medicating? What are the ups and downs of life?
James O'Brien on LBC.
Time is 11:04. I can see a few of you have taken up my suggestion of watching a little bit of that Ronald Reagan speech about immigration, the last speech he ever made in office, a speech I think, as I say, completely unimaginable to hear or imagine that a Republican politician, probably even a Democrat politician or Labour Conservative here would make. Might just a lot of people saying they've just started to watch it and they can't believe it. Might play a little bit for you a bit later on in the show. But first, as I say, we're going to be talking about something a little bit different, getting away from some of the high politics that is going on at the moment, and talk about a story that caught our eye, because I think that it's a really important conversation that I think needs to be had. And I think that for some personal reasons, which I'm happy to describe, but I'm sure it will resonate with a lot of you as well. And of course, we should just say, before we're talking about mental health and antidepressants and all of these things, I'm not a doctor, we're not doctors here, we're not suggesting that you do or do anything. We're going to be talking to a doctor in a moment, but this is, we're not giving medical advice here, we're talking about sort of the politics with a small p of it, and indeed the kind of substance of it. And it all arose really from a story today, which is the parents of Thomas Kingston, the husband of Prince and Princess Michael of Kent's daughter. They've been warning about the side effects of antidepressants after Thomas took his own life. So Mr. Kingston, he was married to Lady Gabriella Kingston, who happens to be the King's second cousin, died from a head injury in February last year at his parents' home in the Cotswolds, and a gun tragically was found near his body. His parents, Martin and Jill Kingston, as a result of this, are now calling for a change in how patients are prescribed selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRI, a widely used type of antidepressant. Martin Kingston has said today that he believes both the patient and the people close to them should be told more explicitly about the potential side effects of the medication, including what can happen if they stop taking it. They're calling on the government to introduce a document that patients have to sign, having been told about the difficulties of going on and then coming off the medication. They are clear, they've said this in the statements they've been making today, in the interview they've given today, that of course for many people these drugs do help whoever they're on, and they're important. But they're saying that they think that there isn't enough information out there for those for whom it might not be help. And it really matters, of course, because, as you will know, many of you listening to this may well be on these drugs now, or similar sort of drugs, but it has become more and more common to use antidepressants in terms of dealing with mental health. So more than 8.7 million people now in England, 8.7 million, are being prescribed antidepressants, or were being prescribed antidepressants in the 12 months to March 2024, according to NHS figures. Now, the NHS says that SSRIs generally have fewer side effects than most other types of antidepressant, and that the majority of people will only experience a few mild side effects, though they do say that some people do have suicidal thoughts and a desire to self-harm when they first take them, and they advise anyone who is taking them to tell a relative or close friend that they've started taking antidepressants, and ask them if they're worried about changes in behaviour. Now, it is interesting. Part of the thing that they've said in that interview was that they talk about the pressure that doctors are under often to give out pills when people are suffering difficulty. And I think from anecdotal experience, family experience I have had, I think that is certainly true. And even, just talking for myself here, a few years ago I went through a bit of a difficult period in my life for various reasons. And, I went to the doctor and said I was feeling depressed about things. And, I think I was at the time as well under some pressure from family members to get actually some of those pills, because they could see that I wasn't doing brilliantly and that perhaps I could do with some assistance. And, the doctor there did a great service to me, great service to me, because he said he could see that I was in a very bad place and maybe even a bit of a dark place. But he said that I was sort of asked if I was seeing someone, a counsellor. I said that I was. And then he said that, I could give you these pills. Would you like some antidepressants? And I said, well, I don't know really. And I was, as many people I think in that situation might be, in a, in a sort of state where you're just going to take the advice. Whatever the doctor says, you'll do, because you've kind of sort of surrendered your own faculties really a little bit in that situation, haven't you? And he said, Lewis, I think you'll get through this. I think you'll get through this. And if you're not getting through it in, say, 2 weeks' time or whatever it happens to be, come back to me and we can talk again. But, there are side effects with these things. And once you're on them, you can't just come off them easily. And I wouldn't want to see you get into a position where, that was a problem for you. And I didn't think much of it at the time. I remember some family members of mine were rather annoyed about it at the time. But I think in retrospect now, that was a great service. It was a great service because it was, to some extent, I suppose, taking a bit of a risk for himself because, I could have complained about it, or if, the situation had declined, then they may have, they may have had some culpability or whatever. But I think it was actually it was right and brave because for me, and this would certainly not be true for everybody, and it's no besmirchment on anybody who doesn't, as I say, I've got family members who have been on them and so on. But if I'm glad that he didn't, and I'm glad that he gave me different bits of advice of stuff I could do to try and make sure I was sleeping and all of these different things. And I think that for me was definitely the right thing. And I do wonder, and as I say, I've got family members in this situation in the past who, and people I know, have wondered, are antidepressants the right thing? Is it the first thing too often? And are we aware enough about the potential side effects? Because, of course, it sounds great. You take them and you feel better. But maybe we do need to have a better conversation about over-medicating for mental health, that we've had this important turn to being more open and talking transparently about mental health, which is really, really important. But that perhaps we both overestimate how many times in our lives we need medical intervention to deal with these things. I want to talk to you about whether you think we are over-medicating mental health problems and whether antidepressants are given out too easily. Maybe you have your own experiences of this. Maybe you disagree. 0345 6060 973 0345 6060 973. Let's talk first to Dr. Simon Opher, Labour MP for Stroud now, of course, leading GP, chair of the all-party group Beyond Pills. Simon, Dr. Opher, I suppose I should say, thank you so much for joining us this morning. What is your take on this? Do you think that antidepressants have become too regularly prescribed?
Yeah, I think they are. I think we got to remember, and it's really important, that some people really, need these and really benefit from antidepressants. But I think what's happened in our society is that, doctors get about 10 minutes per patient, a GP. If someone comes in with feelings of distress and stuff, that's not very long to discuss stuff. And on top of that, there's not much that they can actually refer to. So if you try and refer, in my area, for mental health or counselling or psychological therapy, it takes months to get that appointment. So you feel as a doctor that you have to do something to help that person. So that's when you sort of reach for your prescription pad and maybe start some antidepressants. Now, the guidance really is that with mild to moderate depression, you shouldn't start with tablets. But I think some doctors are beginning with tablets because there's nothing else available for that. And I think another thing is we need to start looking elsewhere for things to make you better. So it sounds like, Lewis, you had a really good doctor, someone who was willing to talk to you and listen to you. And there's certain things that really might help people. So I'm really in favour of doing something a little bit different. Maybe you just need a week off work, for example. Sometimes you need some help with housing or money or benefits or something like that. And the other thing to do is to try and get people to do something different. So I'm a great proponent of using people to do creative things, like just either that or getting out into nature or actually doing some exercise can really help. So we ought to be looking at trying different things first for people. But I must emphasise that it's not to say antidepressants aren't useful for some people, but really 8.7 million people, that's way too many. That's 1 in 5 of the adult population in England are on these tablets. So that's clearly not the best way. I think we are over-prescribing. There's no doubt about that.
Is there pressure, Simon, on doctors, on GPs to prescribe them, either from patients or just generally?
There's not specific pressure for doctors to do it, but there's a feeling, I think, with doctors there's nothing else available. That's one of the issues. The other thing is that these drugs can really help people. So I have seen patients who are really low, and it does help them. So it's all done in good faith. So I wouldn't in any way suggest that GPs are doing this because they're feeling lazy and can't be bothered to do anything else. It's just that these other things aren't available to patients. And if you've got someone who's very acutely distressed and you say, well, there's a 3-month wait to see a psychologist, that's not going to help them at all. So you really want to do something straight away to help them. But I mean, this case was really about really tragic side effects of antidepressants, and all medicines have side effects, and that's why I really think we should try non-medical treatments for quite a lot of things, particularly in mental health, because tragically they do slightly increase the suicide risk. And probably even more importantly for a lot of people, it's really difficult to come off these tablets. You have to do it over a really long period of time. So there's a couple of problems. People going on them have a slightly increased suicide risk, which we saw with Thomas Kingston, which was really tragic. And then there's a problem with actually coming off these tablets as well. So we need to stop putting people on them in the first place and then help people get off them, I think.
Why do you think I'm always really surprised by this, Simon. I mean, as I've had members of my own family who've suffered with mental health problems, but I've often been struck by and surprised at the extent to which some of the things that you've described, diet, exercise, activities in your life, leisure activities, recalibrating your life, I've often been surprised at the extent to which those things are not brought up, not talked about, not addressed, not encouraged, not even actually asked about. And that amazes me, really. And I don't know whether it's because the NHS is fundamentally, it is a medical service. There's a kind of reflex to think about kind of a pharmaceutical intervention rather than other things. But I'm surprised, and this is just my own experience, but I'm surprised at the extent to which those things aren't more prioritised.
Yeah, well, I tend to agree with you, Lewis. I think we should, as doctors, promote things. And there is this thing called a social prescription where doctors can actually say, why don't you try and, because actually one of the problems in our society as well is social isolation, particularly as you get older, but even in younger people. And, actually meeting up with people is very, very good for our mental health. And one of the things about these social prescriptions, it gets people mixing in society again. And I think maybe it's something about the internet age and mobile phones and that sort of thing, but I think we're getting more atomized, we're getting more isolated, and it's really good to sort of start mixing up. So I agree with you totally. I think doctors should be looking at these sort of alternative methods, and it should be made easy for them to access them, and there shouldn't be a long wait for them either. And actually, the NHS has done this to an extent. We just need to expand it a bit, I think. But you're right. I mean, things like exercise is so important for our mental health, and actually, even at this time of year, going out for a walk, just in the fresh air and just noticing things like, what the weather's like, or chatting to a stranger, they're all really good for us. And I think we've lost that to a degree. So what happens is what would have been a bit of distress at some point is now labelled as depression, which, there's some justification for. But if we label everything as depression, we start treating it in a medical way, that's not very good for patients, I don't think.
Do you think we do attach the word depression to too many different types of things which aren't really depression?
Yeah, I think we do. I mean, it's difficult to say because I mean, on one hand, you were saying before that it's really good, and I really respect you, Lewis, for talking about your own mental health issues. And I think it's really good that more of us do this, and so it becomes a bit more normalised. But also, if we start to sort of phrase, so you can have mild depression, that doesn't mean that you need tablets, or you can just say, I'm a bit cheesed off with stuff at the moment, but I'm sure I'll get better from stuff. So yeah, the labelling is difficult, but on the other hand, I wouldn't push us back to the eras 40 years ago where no one talked about how they felt, because that's not healthy either. It's just that we don't, these mild to moderate depression, or whatever you want to call it, distress, does not need tablets, and I think that's what we've got to get away from. But talking about it, I think is good. So, and people like yourself talking about what you've been through is very, very helpful for people, because they realise it's quite normal. And I love the way your doctor didn't do very much, and you presumably you got much better, because you seem pretty well now. So
No, exactly. Well, precisely. So I think that in particular, in my case, there is a difference, it seems to me, between a sort of acute bout of something which may have been brought on by particular triggers, a particular event, and maybe someone who has been suffering for something over a much longer period. But as you say, I'm very grateful to Dr. Simon Opher there, Labour MP for Stroud, leading GP, chair of the all-party group Beyond Pills. And as I was saying there, I am, and again, maybe it's not just my own experience, but as I say, because of watching family members who have had mental health problems over time. I have to say, I do have something of it. It may even be the prejudice, or certainly, let's put it this way, what is it? An anxiety, funnily enough, given what we're talking about, an anxiety about the over-medication and about the reliance on pharmaceutical interventions with regards to depression. Because although of course it's important, particularly if someone is in a particularly bad state and has been for a long time, my instinct is that there are often many other factors at play, and you could be making the situation worse than before you make it better. What are your thoughts? Are we over-medicalising depression and anxiety and so on? Are these just often things that are part of the ups and downs of life? And we should be more wary, more sceptical about putting pills in our bodies to deal with them. 0345 6060 973. 0345 6060 973. You're listening to Lewis Goodall here sitting in for James O'Brien. The time is 11:19.
James O'Brien on LBC.
Time is 11:21. We're talking about whether or not it is that we over-medicate depression and anxiety, and whether or not it would be better for at least some people to not go on these pills at all, to address other parts of their life, not least because we know there are side effects. They're not easy, as we were hearing from the doctor there. They are not easy to come off once you've started. With over 8 million people now on antidepressants, this following the death of Thomas Kingston, who tragically took his own life after being put on some of these pills, and his family believing that the side effects were responsible for that. Let's talk to Anne, who is in Worthing. Anne. Morning.
Hello.
Morning.
Morning.
And you have something to say about this?
Yes, I do, because I tragically lost my own son to suicide when he was 22 years old.
Oh, I'm so sorry to hear that.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, and my life has changed completely. And one of the things I did was to campaign about the prescribing of antidepressants, and I've set up my own charity called Ollie's Future to raise awareness. And the work that I did was to campaign to change the NICE guidelines, because I felt like Thomas Kingston's mum that he had an adverse reaction to citalopram, which he was prescribed over the phone by his doctor he'd never actually seen. And because of that, I managed to change the NICE guidelines so that anyone being prescribed for the first time an antidepressant should be seen face to face, which wasn't the case with my son. So it was a case of antidepressants being given to this young man, my beautiful son, who then took his life 4 days later without even having talked to a doctor face to face.
Gosh.
So, which I thought I was absolutely shocked when I realised that actually there wasn't a NICE guideline in place to say that they should be seen, especially young people. We know that the risks of suicide are very greater with people under the age of 25. And as I say, my son was 22. He'd never had antidepressants before. No. And he'd had a fantastic life, loving family, got a first in history just 6 months before from UCL. So I really wanted to raise the awareness of the risks of antidepressants and teach about suicide prevention as well. So I'm working with medical students now to teach them about having a conversation around suicide, not just going straight to that prescription for antidepressants. I suppose, Anna,
as you say, because your son was so young, one of the reasons, but also I suppose would have had so little conception of the side effects they might have.
Exactly. And that was the same with myself. I've never had antidepressants.
No,
I had no idea. You actually just put your faith in the doctors. You think they've got something that can help. And in Oliver's case, he had suddenly felt very depressed and become anxious about his choice of career. He was working in China. He felt he'd made a mistake, and but didn't really know what direction his life was taking, which I think is common for a lot of young people, having just graduated.
Of course.
And yet, he wasn't really given the full care, I think, that he should have had. And as I say, was prescribed over the phone. He had seen a doctor in January, so we're actually coming up to the 8th anniversary of his death. He died on Valentine's Day. And I think, it has, the positive legacy. I have been on LBC before, actually, talking to Nick Ferrari, And we have done amazing work in his memory. We've delivered our suicide prevention training to 6,000 people now.
Wow.
And we do deliver that to GPs, and we deliver it to medical schools as well. But that doesn't bring him back.
And of course, Anne, I mean, this is actually a problem in terms of specifically young people and their mental health. I mean, it's a problem that appears to be getting worse, not better. It's the anxiety and mental health problems for young people apparently getting worse every year, if the data's anything to go by.
Yes. It's very sad. It's a very sad indictment of our society, I think. And I do believe that, well, my feeling is that raising awareness around the risks of antidepressants, being able for us to all be able to talk with those we love or those we know at work or friends and family about thoughts of suicide, there's preventative measures that we can all learn to talk and ask about suicide. I think they're so important rather than this response of giving out these antidepressants, which can have an adverse reaction, as in the case of Jill's son and my son too. Something called akathisia, which is probably not known as much, but there's been a book that's been written by Katinka Newman called The Pill That Steals Lives. There's a lot of us that have been saying this for a while, and I'm just so grateful to Jill, who I've now got to know, for being able to talk so well and so openly and honestly about what happened to her, and actually working in, to bring this coroner's court verdict, because with my son, even though I said all these things, it was just a straightforward suicide. But I know in my heart that had it not been for those pills, yes, he had depression, yes, he had anxiety because he wasn't sure about his life choices. He thought he'd made a mistake. A very high achiever. So when things don't go well for a high achiever, it really affected him. But I do think the thing that pushed him over the edge was the citalopram, which he took for 4 days, and then he died. So,
well, Anne, I'm sure he'd be very proud of everything that you've done in his memory and his honour. We're really, really grateful for you for sharing that, particularly as we're so close to the anniversary of your son's tragic death. Anne, thanks so much. Let's talk to Ollie in Surbiton about, I think, has actually taken SSRIs in the past. Ollie.
Hi, Lewis. Yeah, no. So I've got first-hand experience of a couple of SSRIs. And I think this is a really important conversation. I think it's a really complex one. Just listening to Anne's story and the work that she's done, amazing. And I think I personally had quite a rubbish experience with citalopram to begin with. Obviously, not nearly as bad as has done Ollie. But I think the really important message that we don't get out there is that the SSRIs aren't a solution. I think I try and liken it to people of, if you were someone that suffered from really, really severe back pain and it was getting you down to the point that, you're not living any kind of quality of life, you're really unhappy, it's stopping you doing the things you love doing, you want to do something about it. The first thing you're going to do is go to a doctor, and they're going to prescribe you with a painkiller. Mm-hmm. And for some people, that painkiller will improve their quality of life, but ultimately the back pain's going to come back. And when that back pain comes back, you're going to find yourself either back at the doctor or looking for something else to mask that pain. So a good doctor is going to say, right, here's a painkiller. This could help you in the short term. And this could enable you to do the things that are going to help you with that pain in the long run. So using the back pain analogy, that would probably be physio. But that's what's going to help you long term, and that's what's going to fix the issue. But if you would say to someone in immense pain in that moment when they're really, really feeling it, okay, I'm going to prescribe you some physio. You're not going to get it for 3 months, and in reality, it's probably going to take 12 months before it really, really starts to take effect. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's a horrendous place. It's a position I've been in. And, you sort of think, well, where else do I turn and what do I do?
Yeah. And do you think overall, do you think that the pills were more helpful to you than not?
I think I take something called sertraline now. I've reduced the dose over the years, and I've taken it alongside doing a lot of therapy. You spoke earlier about things like diet and exercise. That absolutely helps. But again, when you're in that really rubbish low place, someone says to you, "We'll just go for a run, mate." You think, "Oh, brilliant! Why didn't I think of that?" Stop eating so much sugar. Okay, it's fine. But what if sugar's the only thing that actually is making me feel better about myself?
Do you think we do? I mean, to go back to the central question, do you think we do? Sure. Do you think we over-medicate, do you think, anxiety and depression now?
I would say, from my experience with GPs, I think I would imagine, I obviously don't have any data or anything to really back this up, but from my experience, I would say that some doctors probably do lean that way. I think I had a doctor recently that was actually very similar to the one that you spoke about earlier. I'd say that he was the one that really broke a cycle for me. And his sort of approach was, okay, well, yeah, look, let's get you on these. Let's make sure you're on the right dose. But he also monitored me. He called me.
Yeah.
He made follow-up calls. He tried to get me all kinds of help. But I remember we sat down, and this was quite powerful, I think. And he sat there to me one day and said, "You're pretty much doing everything you can, and there's nothing with the system the way it is right now that I can do for you. There's no more that I can do for you because of waiting lists, etc." Mm-hmm. So in that situation, what else was there? What else was there? Yeah. And I think if you're a doctor, and you've also only got, 10, 15 minutes?
Yeah.
And you've got someone sat in front of you.
Yeah. It's really hard. It's really hard.
I think what would really help is education, stuff like, that your call around was talking about, like, amazing, great work. I don't know if SSRIs and antidepressants need a bit of like a rebrand. Yeah. People need to, like, if someone could shoe in the word support in there, or there's enough S's in there already. But...
Well, yes. SSRI. Ollie in Surbiton, really grateful to someone who's got first-hand experience of this. And again, we repeat, this is not advice. We're not saying that you should or shouldn't do anything. And there are people, I can see someone, Jamie's message into saying one of these drugs saved my life twice. It really does help, and I've absolutely no doubt about that whatsoever. But there is, of course, a question about side effects, and there is a question about, with nearly, 8.5 million people on these drugs, whether all of those people need to be on them, and whether they are overprescribed for depression and anxiety, when other things, non-medical interventions, would work better. 0345 6060 973. You're listening to Lewis Goodall here on LBC. In all this week for James O'Brien. Let's get the very latest LBC News headlines, 11:34 with Thomas Watts.
James O'Brien on LBC.
Time is 11:37. We're talking in this hour of the show about antidepressants and the question as to whether or not they are overprescribed as a result of and following conditions or experiences or things which could be treated more effectively by other means that the NHS, maybe because they just medicate too quickly, because it ultimately is a medical service. And as we've been hearing, GPs, they don't have much time. Also, the things that could really help, maybe some counselling and so on, are simply, as we know, not available right now through the NHS very often because the waiting lists are so huge. You want to have something to say about this, and you can ring 0345 6060 973. Will is in Bromley and has done exactly that. Will, morning.
Good morning, Lewis. Thanks very much for taking my call. I'm a big fan.
Not at all. Thank you for phoning in. What do you think about this? Do you think that there is overprescription or overdiagnosis of these things?
I think potentially yes. I mean, first to say, I'm not anti those medications. I've been taking them for years, and without them, I probably wouldn't be sitting here right now.
You think so? You think they were that helpful? They saved your life?
Yes, they did. But I think that's partially because there's a lack of, as you mentioned, there's a lack of any other sort of easily accessible support. Even sort of back in, I would say, 2018, so pre-pandemic, everything like that, it was still about a 6-month wait for trauma therapy. And that was purely 8 sessions. I couldn't sort of have any more when my symptoms worsened. So the only option was to go down the route of medication. I initially resisted it, but yeah, I had an amazing GP, like the first caller you spoke to. She was absolutely amazing and said, no, you need to try diet and exercise, see how you go. But yeah, it just, my symptoms worsened, and then I'm now sort of taking 200 milligrams of sertraline a day, and there's not a huge amount available that I can do to get off them.
Will, do those have side effects, or do they have initial side effects and then you sort of get used to it? I don't know. What do those exist?
So initially, I was told initially, you may just have a bit of instability in your mood, and then things should settle down. And that, the doctor did tell me that, and that was absolutely right. I do get a couple of side effects, but it's manageable within my daily life. But I think your caller Ollie, who put it perfectly, they are like a painkiller, essentially, for the mental health issue, and
they sort of deal with the effects, but not necessarily the cause.
No, absolutely, that's absolutely right. But and just in your comment around sort of there's therapy not easily being available due to waiting lists, it's actually to say, I'm in the fortunate position to be able to try and get private therapy, and even there, all the ones that have been recommended to me, sorry, we're full up.
Really?
We're not taking. There are so many people trying to get those services that it's. My sort of real question is, what else is there apart from trying to manage with these medications?
And would you be afraid to come off the drugs, Will?
Yeah, I am. I know I eventually have to do it, and I'm looking at other alternative ways. I'm in the fortunate position. I've got a family member who's amazing and very into alternative therapy, so she's been really helpful, and I'm just trying to work out, is there something that's going to be able to help?
Do you think that, you say you have to come off, how long do you think you'll be on them for, and does it worry you the length of time you'll be on them?
Yeah, it does. I'd like to try to, being able to function properly without them. I don't know, honestly, is the question.
Yeah. Well, Will, thank you.
Just have to sort of play it by ear.
Well, Will, thank you for being so frank about it and so revealing, because it really is interesting. And for those of us who've not been on them or maybe had relatives who are, it is so useful to hear it directly, both the pluses and minuses. And that's what we're hearing from everybody, isn't it? Which is to say, and I think it is absolutely key and central, which is that these are drugs which can save your life. And we're certainly not in the business and never would suggest to anyone what they should do. It's also true, a lot of the people on them who say in the one breath that they've saved their lives do also say they're concerned, obviously, about the length of time on which they might have to be on them, and indeed the side effects, and indeed the question of maybe if there were other non-pharmaceutical interventions that could be made. They could have been made, and perhaps they would have been better, or at least certainly they might help deal with the underlying causes, whilst these pills sort of take the edge off and get you through the acute period of danger. Problem is there's nothing on the other end of that period to actually deal with the root causes. I think that's the problem that we keep finding. I think many, many people are in. Let's talk to Malcolm, who is in Brighton. Malcolm, morning.
Oh, hello there.
Good morning.
It's very good morning. I love the programme. It's very difficult because for me, I was depressed for many, many years growing up. I come from a broken home. My dad came from abroad and stuff, Ghanaian, and my mum was English. And I also found out I was dyslexic, and it was very hard to deal with. And you can go into really deep black mode, if you know what I mean. You don't know what's going on. And it took me years and years, and they wanted to put me on Prozac, and I saw a couple of friends of mine which were on it. And the thing is, I thought, well, that's not for me, because they were zonked out all the time. When you spoke to them, they didn't know what was going on and things. And for me, what helped me is finding the issue, what was making me really, really bad. It took me years, to be quite honestly. And what was making me bad is I didn't know I was dyslexic till I was well into my 20s. And I was fine. I was going mad because I was having trouble reading and this, that, and the other. Though I'm quite intelligent, but I didn't know what was going on, and also I didn't know where my family was and about me. So I had to say to myself, well, what I'm going to do is try and find out what's wrong with me. I'm not mad. I'm not stupid. I left school at 15 and I hold a job down and everything else. And so what I did is eventually they said to me, you're dyslexic. So I knew that was the trouble because people can make fun of you. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, of course.
And if I said to them, can you read this for me? Because I don't understand what this is, blah, blah, blah. And also with the family bit was making me dance. So eventually what I had to do is say to myself, look, I don't want to go on tablets and medication. They wanted me to see a psychiatrist, and I didn't really want to sort of do that for obvious reasons. And what I eventually did is found where my father was and found out that was really what was making me ill, not knowing who I was, not knowing I had dyslexic, and not knowing me. Does that make sense?
Yeah, of course it does, yeah.
So, of course, that was making me really, really, really depressed. And people used to say to me, where are you from? What's your mother's name? And I didn't know. And as the years went on, I didn't realise it was affecting the way I operated, the way I thought and everything else. And so I had to say to myself, well, what I'm going to try and do is find out what's going on. So I found out I was dyslexic in the late 20s. And eventually I found my father and everything else. Sadly, he died before I could get to him, but I went over to Ghana and I found that helped me. And I'm really pleased I didn't go on the medication. I'm really pleased I didn't see the psychiatrist. And now with my life, I'm like a flower now. I'm starting to see the right things now. Does that make sense?
Of course it does. Of course it does.
And it's very hard when you're in the dark side. I can understand why people commit suicide. There isn't the help there at the moment for people like us suffering with things. And also, when you've got this sort of illness, you can't see it. It's not like if you have a leg chopped off, you can see it. But when you've got it inside, does that make sense?
Yeah.
You can't see you can't see it. So
it's very hard to identify what it is.
It's very hard.
Yeah.
And to explain
particularly when you're in that
people.
state of mind.
Yes, you've hit it on the head. And thanks to your program, because it allows people like myself and millions of others to express what goes on and stuff, because it's very, very hard to live with depression and mental illnesses. And thank you very much for your program.
No, not at all, Malcolm. Thank you so much for sharing your story. It's really, really important. It is a reminder to anyone out there right now who is suffering, is afflicted by mental health problems, fear, perhaps you're in a very, very dark place. I can speak from personal experience. You'll come out the other side. You've got to have that tenacity, and you've got to rely on those to help you who will get you through, but you will. And Malcolm obviously also speaking very much in that vein as well. And maybe that will involve pharmaceutical intervention. Maybe it won't. Maybe it will be about other things. But in that moment, of course, very, very difficult for you to see where you might go, that there will be another side. But take it from me, there definitely is. You're listening to Lewis Goodall here on LBC. We'll be going to continue this conversation about mental health and about whether antidepressants are always the right answer. 0345 60 60 973. Number never changes, does it? Time is 11:47.
James O'Brien on LBC.
Time is 11:50. Just had a message here from Marion saying, Lewis, way better than Suella Braverman. It's taking you 2 days to decide that. Marion, actually quite offended. God's sake, get a grip. It was only about a minute or so it probably took for everybody else to decide. No, only joking, Suella. You're absolutely fantastic. Let's talk to Louise, who is in Billericay. Louise.
Hi, Lewis. How are you?
Good, thank you. We're talking about mental health, of course, and I think your dad was a GP, is that right? Had depression himself?
Yes, he did. And I've got 2 points to make, Lewis. The first one is this whole context around depression and treatment and sort of medicalisation. My dad, when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, was working as a GP, and he suffered a lot with depression. So I sort of grew up with it. And at that time, I think it's important to remember what people were given for treatment were barbiturates, which,
Gosh.
you know, call-in shows of the days would have been talking about the women who were just prescribed these and left on them for 30 years, you know. So
yeah.
I remember in the 80s when Prozac first came along and the SSRIs, I think my dad prescribed them to himself, and our life changed. His life changed.
Right.
So I think it's really important not to demonise these or to start linking them with...
Yeah, it is a really difficult, it's a balance, it's a difficult tightrope to walk, isn't it, Louise? Because you say, as we've been saying throughout the course of the show, you know, for lots of people, they will literally be lifesavers and you know, be really important in their road to recovery. But then obviously for other people that might not be the case, or maybe for other people there may be a sort of in between of maybe they were quite helpful, but maybe they would have preferred in retrospect not to have the pharmaceutical intervention. It's really difficult.
Yes. Well, what I wanted to say was I always remember my dad, and I hope this might help some listeners that, are hearing this. I always remember him sitting down and talking to me about these drugs and why they were so important. And he was a brilliant doctor. After he died, we got thousands of letters from patients talking about how he was so good at explaining things. And he made it quite simple. And he said, look, if you have an injury to your body, and he said, and you get a big cut, sometimes your body can heal it, but sometimes it needs a bit of help to hold it together while it does what it needs underneath, So you put a plaster on or you put stitches on. And he described these drugs as a sticking plaster for the mind. And the idea they were designed for, Lewis, which picks up what you were saying about there's nothing there and people are just prescribing them. And your earlier doctor that was, the MP that was saying, there's no option. But how these are meant to be used is they're meant to be prescribed for 6 months. And during that time, they help somebody to even out to a point where they can then start utilising other help. And the real problem you're talking about today is that the other side of that equation no longer exists. Yes. So that's what's driving it into the thing where people are being over-medicalised, along with, I think, we talk about the pandemic intermittently now, but the trauma that we suffered as a society is a direct link. The most undiagnosed condition in this country is trauma. And a lot of the time, people are being diagnosed with the symptoms of trauma as their main diagnosis, OCD, anxiety, all of this stuff. So earlier in the show, it all knits together, Lewis. One of your callers called in and said we'd only had Labour in power for 13 and a half years. And I remember, because I grew up with and worked with the NHS, when we had Thatcher and they shut down all of the mental institutions and they were supposed to introduce care in the community. And that's the line back to where the failure started, because there just is not the care there. You have people calling all the time about CAMS, populated by really dedicated people, but just not enough of them. And all the people that are now being called over-medicalised, the people who have nowhere to go, that are not getting the treatment they need. And I say this as somebody who, my own cousin took his own life after he was on one of these drugs, and his dad was also a GP. And I think what we need more education about who's suitable, but we really need a national emergency on mental health, Lewis. I despise Trump, but he's declaring emergencies on certain things. And I think that this government could learn from that. And I think there are 2 or 3 areas they should be declaring a national emergency so they can legislate specific funding and specific action. And mental health needs to be one of them. Otherwise, we'll be having this conversation for the next 5 years.
Louise there in Billericay, talking about trauma, and certainly there's a lot of it during COVID, and I'm sure there is a lot of legacy to that. I think actually a lot of the lingering effects in our politics at the moment come down to COVID and how that has not been internalised properly in so many different ways. I'm always a little bit reluctant sometimes. I think this is a slightly different conversation, but when we're talking about trauma, there is often a desire now to dwell very much and to try and really kind of sort of understand all of these things and to say, well, we're sitting with trauma and all those sorts of things. Maybe that's helpful for some people. I also think that perhaps for others, it isn't necessarily a bad thing to sort of look away and move on. That's probably not very fashionable to say now, but I think that there is, for some people at least, something to be said for it. Let's talk to Anne, who's in Penrith. Anne.
Hello.
Morning, Anne. What do you think on this question about, are we over-prescribing, over-medicalising depression?
My personal experience is that sometimes I feel that medical professionals, if they don't really fully understand what is wrong with their patient, then they fall back on the diagnosis of anxiety or depression.
Yeah.
And so if they don't understand the symptoms that somebody is experiencing, then they would start to question whether or not the illness is psychosomatic. And that is my concern, that I think that does happen. And I'm not saying that that's happening in all cases at all, but I do think that this does happen. And so if you present at a doctor's surgery and you go and see your GP, and the GP, your symptoms, they don't quite understand what's going on, as is often the case with post-viral illness.
And you don't have much time.
Then you end up being prescribed antidepressants. I personally have suffered with long COVID, and you can go to the doctors with long COVID and they don't really fully understand, not that the information isn't available, but the medical profession aren't well trained. And so a lot of people who are presenting with things like long COVID or other post-viral things, they often end up on these medications when really the actual cause of their illness is not being treated.
Okay, Anne, grateful to you. I want to quickly, and I'm afraid it isn't much time, Chris, but Chris in Tower Hamlets, I think, has an experience on this. Chris, briefly, if you don't mind.
Yes, hi. I was fortunate enough to self-admit myself to one of the private hospitals in North London at a cost, because I was trying to get appointments with my doctors. I was going to the hospital, telling them that I was really, in desperate need. To be told that I could only see my doctor, 4 to 6 weeks, I needed help. So I had some savings, and it was costing me almost £100 a night to have this self-admit myself, so I could be somewhere safe and to be given, the right medication to help me. So touch wood, I'm better now. I had a relapse a couple of weeks ago, and I couldn't afford to go back to this institute, this private institute. I had to go to the hospital to be told that I couldn't be seen, or I was told to sit there for 16 hours, and somebody would come from a mental health team to talk to me. And I just took myself out of the situation and went home and, kind of said, right, let me write down my thoughts, let me be positive, let me, try and treat myself. And I think the problem we've got here is, these tablets are a placebo, I'd say 3 to 6 months. And we are over-medicating people. I think there needs to be a step 2, and that is after the tablets, there should be, a recuperation phase where people are spoken to, help, assist, and that's what's lacking in our society today. And that's why people have just been topped up after 6 months with another 6 months worth of tablets.
All right, Chris, you had the last word on that, and really, really helpful. I'm really grateful to all of you as well for the thoughts and experiences you've had. And it is just worth saying, if you are in a dark place or a difficult place or anything like that at the moment, you can always phone Samaritans. They're available on 116 123, there to help at any time, 24 hours a day. We're going to move on now, though, and talk a little bit about what is going on in Washington. We covered a lot on the show yesterday about tariffs, but in a way, with President Trump deciding to cancel or at least postpone those tariffs overnight, the real story was going on with, well, who else? Elon Musk, who is tightening his control over broad swathes of the US government at extraordinary speed, prompting growing alarm both from Democrats, journalists, and even some of his rivals from within the government. But is all this actually just really necessary? Is this a coup, or about time someone got to grips with the bureaucracy?
James O'Brien on LBC.
It's just coming up to 12:04. You're listening to Lewis Goodall sitting in for James O'Brien all this week here from 10 to 1 on LBC. We talked a lot yesterday, didn't we, about what was going on in Washington. We were seeing, it appeared as if it was a reframing of the global economic and political order. Well, of course, by the time that the sun set over the Potomac yesterday, things started to look a little bit differently, certainly with regards to all of the tariffs that we were talking about. Gone were the proposed tariffs, or postponed or deferred in any case, were the proposed tariffs from the Trump administration on Mexico first, and then by the end of the day on Canada as well, postponed for 30 days after positive conversations, apparently, phone calls between Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, Trump, and Claudia Sheinbaum, the President of Mexico. Trump claims that they've agreed to do various things that he wants, and so they'll be postponed. For now, different leaders in Canada and Mexico have rather different interpretations of it, but that's by the by. We can return to that at another juncture. There were other things going on in Washington yesterday, though, in the United States. And in some ways, I think they were far more significant, certainly given now the tariffs have been proposed. And this all connects with the, potential transformation that we're seeing of the US federal government led by efforts, of course, by none other than now President Trump's close confidant, advisor, and of course just someone who happens to be the world's richest man, Elon Musk. We hinted and talked about this a little bit yesterday with the changes he's being made to US aid, the US aid program. But these changes are being applied to the wider federal democracy as well. He's tightening his control over broad swathes, it's New York Times saying this, over broad swathes of the United States government at extraordinary speed, which is prompting growing alarm from Democrats and other constitutional scholars and others. In the 2 weeks since President Trump's inauguration, Musk, heading up the so-called Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, is transforming the federal bureaucracy, prompting questions about the scope of his authority and warnings from some of a constitutional crisis or even a coup. Bear in mind, he is doing this without the oversight of the Congress, their equivalent of Parliament, and Musk and his people have been going into these buildings, going in, seizing control of the buildings, taking control of the security networks inside, taking away the people who work there, their security passes, and so on, have shut down the US main foreign aid agency, which is going to take away aid for tens of millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars, $40 billion altogether of US federal aid around the world, one of the biggest international aid donors in the world. They've gained access to classified material and sensitive details. This is Musk and his people who've just gone into these federal agencies and seized sensitive detail about millions of Americans, including taking control of a payment system that manages the flow of trillions of dollars of government spending. Musk has been named as a special government employee by the White House, but of course he does not hold elected office. He's not part of Trump's cabinet, whose members require confirmation by the US Senate, and he does not have an official government position as such. Richard Painter, who served as the chief White House ethics lawyer, has said, in previous administrations, including Republican administrations, so a Republican guy, has said, I've never seen anything like this. Never in the history of the country. We always have the president and the cabinet and the Treasury Secretary confirmed by the Senate. Cabinet members are installed by the president. They coordinate with the White House. You can't just not spend money appropriated by Congress. So we have something completely unusual, unorthodox going on in Washington. You're having the government itself being reshaped, and as I repeat, going up to and including payment systems worth trillions of dollars being basically handed over to Musk, who is a unelected official, not even an official, someone without confirmation by the institutions, but also over whom there is very little to no oversight right now. We do not know what he is doing, in whose name apart from Trump, and under what authority he's doing it, other than Trump's authority that we are not sure that Trump himself even has. And why is he doing it? Well, he says he's doing it because he wants to slash government bureaucracy. He wants to transform the US federal government, which spends trillions and trillions of dollars a year, and he wants to cut it by a third, by $2 trillion of a total federal government budget of $6 trillion. He says, Musk that is, that requires tough surgery, tough love. He wants to go in and transform it. Now, whether he'll be able to do that or not is a separate question that we might get into. Question, I suppose, that I want to talk to you about is whether or not we should be very, very worried about this. There are some people calling it a coup. The fusion between MAGA, political power, and technological power in the form of Musk. Someone who is already plugged into our brains at all times, certainly if you're on one of his platforms. He might be able to buy TikTok. Trump might allow him to buy TikTok. That would give him even more informational power to be able to feed the ideas that he has in his head into our brains. And we've seen how that's worked out with British politics over the last month or two. Doing, among other things, endorsing and suggesting that Tommy Robinson is a political prisoner. Some complete nonsense, of course. Insulting Jess Phillips, calling her a child genocide apologist, and so on and so forth. So we've plenty of misinformation. So he might be about to become even more powerful still, which matters to us. But then there's the question, I suppose, and maybe you think this, maybe in order to get to grips with bureaucracy, in order to get to grips with a government that never seems to stop expanding, in order to get to grips with huge vested interests in the form of the bureaucracy that there is, and there is lots of vested interests there, maybe you need someone like Musk. Maybe you need someone who is that innovative. Maybe you need someone who is willing to break some eggs in order to make that omelette. And my word, is he breaking eggs left, right, and centre right now. What is Elon Musk? Is he a coup with a Twitter account, a walking coup with a Twitter account, or is he an innovator and someone we need an equivalent of in this country to get to grips with UK government bureaucracy. 0345 6060973, 0345 6060973. First, let's talk to Bruce Daisley. He's former Vice President of Twitter for Europe, Middle East and Africa, is a very keen Musk watcher. Bruce, this is unprecedented, isn't it?
Yeah, well, firstly, we know exactly the playbook he's using because he used exactly the same playbook when he finally took over Twitter. And he went through the same stages. He moved people into the buildings, and apparently he's taken up residence across the road from the main building he's based in Washington. He's working all weekend, and he talked this weekend about the advantage that gives him over his adversaries. And that's an interesting phrase, isn't it? The idea that he's at war with the people who he's now running is an illustration of how deep-rooted this sense of a deep state has polluted the thinking of people like Musk, that they think that somehow the government and government machinery is somehow in opposition to normal people. So, yeah, we've witnessed this playbook before, but it is completely remarkable, I think, for a democratic country.
He's been going in, and there's been a lot of concern, hasn't there, that he's getting access to federal government payment systems, which are potentially worth huge amounts of money, and information that he might have access to over which there is no one really looking over his shoulder and asking why has he got access to that and what is he going to do with it.
And the real strange conundrum at the heart of this is that people who've then gone on and announced and promoted the team who were working with him, and by all accounts, they seem to be young people under the age of 25, people who've announced their names, he's told people tweeting their names out that they're committing a crime. In the sense, say, the people who are shining a light and putting sunlight on what he's doing, he seems to have a sense that he wants to keep that private while wanting to unearth whatever payments we're going to find in this colossal bank of financial transactions. So it's very strange. He seems to want this asymmetry of information. He wants everything he does to be private and everything the government does to be public. All of it seems, you can understand why politicians in the US are feeling that there's reason to be alarmed here, because there just doesn't seem to be any way to hold him to account for what he's doing.
What do you think he wants, Bruce? I mean, he already has access. He's already got huge power and influence over Trump. He's got huge power and influence via Twitter, his tech platforms. He has huge power, influence, and money that derives from his wider business interests. What more does he want? What does he want at this point?
He seems to focus, when it comes to his disruptive instincts, he seems to focus first and foremost on dismantling. And he dismantled Twitter when he took over. He sacked about 80% of the employees in the end, but did it in a graceless and quite aggressive way. And you might say, okay, well, Twitter's still going, but the X platform, that it's now called, is smaller, poorer, and worse than it was before. So I don't think anyone could say, even he can't say, he emailed employees last week saying that the business was on the verge of bankruptcy. I don't think even he would say that it's a success story. And yet he's brought this same playbook to what he's doing at the government here. And I think he just wants to disrupt by dismantling, really.
But I mean, surely, that's potential huge risk for that. The US federal government, Twitter's important, or was important, but ultimately we can all live without Twitter, right? Lots of people have left the platform. It does not need to exist. The US federal government does things like, providing people with pensions, providing people with benefits, providing people with healthcare, defense, all of these things that it does around the world. You can disrupt that, but the potential costs of doing so and it going wrong are potentially massive.
I think we've got used to these oligarchs seeming removed, living in rarefied air, not necessarily being connected to what's going on. But there seems to be something singular about Musk, where he appears to have no empathy whatsoever. So whether that is the way that he has singled out individuals, people who either have worked for the government or worked for his other companies, the way he's singled out other individuals without understanding the consequence of his actions. He's the most followed person on his social media platform, and yet he's very willing to turn the 220 million followers that he's got on often pretty small people who just are normal citizens living their lives. His lack of empathy, I think, really even distinguishes him versus the other oligarch class, really.
Do you think we should be worried in Britain? I mean, obviously, this is happening to the US federal government. There isn't a direct implication. Do you think we should be worried about this, Bruce? About the way he's handling things?
Right now, there doesn't seem to be any consequence for any of his actions. And that presents a big challenge, doesn't it? You know, the idea that he might interfere in British democracy by giving $100 million to one party. Political parties seem a little bit flat-footed. They don't want to mention it. They don't want to bring it up for fear he actually goes through with it. And it's an illustration, really, that a lot of people don't necessarily know how to deal with Musk. I suspect the only way that we can deal with him outside the US is in solidarity, whether it's the UK and the EU making comments about his international actions or demonstrating the similar commitment that the likes of Brazil showed when they said, these are our laws and we're going to implement them. And I suspect the only way we could probably hold Musk accountable here is to say that there's going to be cross-contamination. Anything he does wrong at one of his businesses, we do reserve the right to hold his other businesses responsible. Because otherwise, what can any of us do? And I think that's the challenge outside the US. In the US, I think that it's a much bigger issue. The US Republicans have got control of all three parts of government, and so for the next 2 years at least, it's very difficult to see serious account being held of them.
Do you think there's any possibility? Let's just take a step back here and just ask the question: is there any possibility he succeeds? I mean, could he actually? I mean, you know, as you know better than anyone, Bruce, there are people online who are such Musk devotees, you know, the Musk fanboys, as I call them. They absolutely adore him, and they say, you know, he's the most gifted, industrious person to have ever lived. And indeed, clearly, he's a genius in lots of ways. But do you think there's any prospect that we get to the end of this period, however long Doge is there for, and indeed he has cut the US federal government budget by a third, by $2 trillion, that he'll succeed?
I don't think it's clear what his end is in mind. I don't think it's clear what he wants to accomplish. If there was a version of a plan that he was trying to say that everything would operate more effectively, then I think you could understand that. It's only 18 months ago that he was sitting at that little fireside chat with Rishi Sunak, saying that long term, the promise of artificial intelligence was that everyone in society would be given a minimum basic income. Everyone would be given a sum of money by the government to survive. Now, that's not a government minimalist, but it's an illustration that I don't think there's a consistent, cohesive argument right at the center of what he's doing. In the same way he did with Twitter, he turned it from being a 5 billion turnover business into something that's about a quarter of that. I don't think this man has a plan. I just think he's an individual who lives without any consequence of his actions catching up to him. And as a result, he's become increasingly whimsical. He's become driven by gut instinct without ever fearing what will happen as a result of his actions.
Bruce Daisley there, former vice president of Twitter, giving us his thoughts on exactly what Elon Musk is up to. I want to talk to you about this because I think it is really important. You might not hear it framed in this way in lots of other parts of the media, but we could do so. We do so here on LBC because it is important to consider whether or not what Musk is doing amounts to political acts which are unconstitutional, which are wrong. Maybe there will be a result from it. Maybe there will be the cut in the budget that many Americans want to see and which Trump wants to see. Maybe that will happen. And maybe there's no doubt that Musk is an innovator. Of course, that's self-evident. But when you've got what is being described as a shadow government being set up, on whose authority is that being done? How can it be scrutinized? Should we be worried that the world's richest man is holding and having such power and influence completely unchecked? Unchecked even by American political institutions with all their might. Should we be disturbed by this? Can one person just be too powerful? Because right now it feels that Elon Musk might be the most powerful person, or certainly one of the most powerful people who have ever lived, who do not in some way hold political office. Should we be worried about that? 0345 6060 973. 0345 6060 973. You're listening to Lewis Goodall singing for James O'Brien here on RBC. The time is 12:20.
James O'Brien on LBC.
Time is 12:22. Democrats in Washington, who have been pretty muted on Trump and also since the Trump restoration, have been sort of scattered around. Really, they haven't really known how to channel their opposition well. They've certainly been channeling their opposition about this. Chuck Schumer, the Democratic leader in the Senate, has said the US is witnessing, quote, the hostile takeover of the federal government by an unelected shadow government. New York Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has accused Elon Musk of orchestrating a plutocratic coup. If you want the power, run for office and be chosen by the people, she said. This is what I want to get to the heart at. Is it right that someone who has no mandate of their own and no even authority because they've been put into an actual office by the person who has been elected, is it right for someone who has that much wealth and that much power can exert such influence in that way? Can you be too powerful? Should we be worried? This is a man who already has so much of the world's wealth. He has so much of the world's informational power because he controls X, and he might end up controlling TikTok, who knows? And he seems to be accumulating more and more political power via the institutions of the American federal government. And he's not been elected to anything. Is that dangerous? Or do you think that actually he'll be able to innovate his way through and create benefits in the federal government? I'm pretty sceptical, I have to say. But 0345 6060 973. Let's talk to Katerina, who's in Mill Hill. Katerina.
Hi there. Thank you. Thank you for having me on the radio.
Not at all. What do you think?
I have big worries about Musk being in politics now. You know, we all agree that he's a great disruptor in technology. He's a genius there. And he managed to achieve that partly probably because of his neurodiversity. He admitted he's autistic, and you know, he invests his time into, you know, things that interest him, and they really go deep into it.
Yeah.
Now, that we will not deny. But moving into politics, we should also we should have in mind that neurodiverse people have troubles understanding social interactions, empathy. It's just, you know, it's a deficit. So why would so many people be happy to have a person having an influence on a public opinion via X? You know, why are they happy? Because he is inciting very far right, very dangerous ideas, and he's trying to he's targeting Germany as a call of EU to break it. They're trying to push the falling organization already, and he's also trying to get his hands into the British politics and the reform. That's very, very worrying.
And I suppose, Catherine, the question is whether, I suppose in a way, we've got to divorce his politics in one sense away from it. We might not like his politics. People who are listening to this might not like it. His politics is evolved. But isn't the question a more fundamental one? Should anyone, whatever their politics, have that much power?
It is dangerous because, you know, power for humans it's difficult to actually handle power with responsibility. We've seen it so many times in history when money and power, you know, derail individuals who had good intentions or were, you know, more or less solid in their principles. So I think the fact that he bought X, that's where it already went wrong, but we don't have any regulatory limitations, I guess.
Catherine, we're grateful to you. This question about on whose authority Musk is doing what he's doing is, of course, central. One level, it's obvious, it's Trump. Whether he has the authority to confer that or not is another question. This is Trump, actually. He was in the Oval Office, and the reporter asked him whether he was concerned about what Musk was doing. This is what Trump said.
Why is it important for Elon Musk to have access to the payment systems at Treasury?
Well, he's got access only to letting people go that he thinks are no good if we agree with him, and it's only if we agree with him. He's a very talented guy from the standpoint of management and costs, and we put him in charge of seeing what he can do with certain groups and certain numbers. Some of the numbers are horrible, what he's found. Think of it, $100 million on condoms to Hamas. condoms to Hamas, and many other things that are frankly even more ridiculous. And they're finding tremendous waste, really waste, more than anything else, I think you could say. Probably fraud and abuse can be added to it, the more standard waste, fraud and abuse.
There's a word which has been doing the rounds of late, which is, of course, oligarchy, which literally just means government or governing by a small number of people. There is another word, which I think is getting used less, but probably should get used more, which is plutocracy, which, of course, means wealth, plus kratos, which means strength, governed by the wealthy. And there was an extraordinary sight yesterday of Elon Musk. Whether you think he's an innovator, maybe you think in the long term he'll do good, that's fine, that's your opinion. But what a sight yesterday to see Musk going into the federal government, shutting down US aid, which gives $40 billion a year. I mean, you might not agree with every cent or penny that it spends, but there's no doubt it does a lot of work helping some of the world's poorest people. Basically being shut down, that agency, by the world's richest man. Shutting down flows of income to the world's poorest people. If that's not a plutocracy, government by the wealthy, for the wealthy, I don't know what is. Let's talk to Rose, who's in Tavistock. Rose.
I agree. I've long thought that what we're going to be looking at is a hegemony of billionaires running the world, and I suspect possibly that Trump is a puppet of the extreme right wing. Nobody storms through like that in power somewhere. I'm sorry, nobody storms in, takes power like that with altruistic motives. Nobody. And remember the Heil Hitler salute, and that's not the only worrying example.
Yeah, he said, well, I don't think he's actively... He said that it was interpreted in the wrong way, but yes.
Well, he would.
Yes.
And this man has limitless power over minds, absolutely limitless. He can make impressionable kids think anything he wants. So we're looking at future generations. Remember what the Jesuits said, and I paraphrase. They were conditioning children to think what they believed. Give me a child at an impressionable age, and she or he is mine for life. And I think we have seen now. I read a little piece by your colleague, Simon, yesterday.
Yes.
We're looking at state capture. I mean, it's all so horrifying that I'm just looking at it and thinking, oh, that's interesting, isn't it? I think it's a defence mechanism. It's horrific. This whole internet thing is absolutely appalling. You've got the whole, I'm slightly off subject now, but you've got the whole desensitisation thing going on, where children of 12 are looking at decapitations, and people are saying, oh, well, they're addicted to their phones.
That's not just Musk, though, of course, in fairness, is it, Rose? I mean, that's the whole social media companies, full stop. In fact, you probably see more of that because there aren't that many kids on Twitter. They're more likely to be on other things.
Well, right, but I mean, I'd like to just quickly make the point that when we calmly talk about, oh, well, they're addicted to their phones, no, it's not their responsibility. They're not addicted to them. Not. They have been made addicted, and the addiction always controls. The drink and drugs control you. The technology is controlling them, and that is not by mistake. It cannot be. It must have been known at the start that this is what's going to happen because they're making them addictive. I mean, I know I've slightly gone off, but
it's part of the same thing
together, doesn't it?
No, I think that's right. Do you think does it scare you, Rose?
It scares me so much I can't feel anything. I just have to think, thank God I'm 77.
Gosh.
Yeah, honestly.
Really? And what is it that scares you in particular? If you were to just encapsulate it briefly, what is it?
Complete power by people who have absolutely no interest except their own. They have no feeling for other people whatsoever, and they simply want money and power for its own sake. I think there is a lot going on behind, underneath with these people, that they cannot get enough power because at some point... they have to prove that they can never be less than, they can never be humiliated. So there's no end to the seeking for power. To put it sort of rather trivially, at some point they have been so deeply and profoundly humiliated that they're consumed with the need for power. It's an absolute compulsion.
Rose.
You don't need all that money, do you, for God's sake? There's more to it than that.
More money than you can ever spend. Rose, in Tavistock, grateful to you, putting it extremely succinctly. I think that gets to the absolute heart of what I want to try and get at. which is whatever you think about Elon Musk, and maybe you think he's absolutely brilliant, and maybe you actually think, and maybe he will do some good with the federal government. And look, governments and government bureaucracies, they do expand, and they never stop expanding, and they absorb more and more money. And one of the great myths, for example, is in the 80s that sort of Reagan shrank the government, or that it happened here with Thatcher. It didn't really. It may have stayed roughly still, or it would have just sort of grown in other ways, even if you shrink at different elements of it. So it does tend to have a trend, and, you know, it's not ignoble or wrong to want to try and put a stop to that. But, first of all, can it actually ever really happen? And does Musk even have the first bit of understanding about how to make that happen without punishing very, very vulnerable and poor people who rely on what the government does? That's number one. But number two, even if it were possible, he has technological, cultural, political and economic power, the likes of which I cannot find a parallel for. And shouldn't we be worried about that? Can one man have too much power? 0345 6060 973. We're going to be checking in with the latest on what is going on with the Lucy Letby case, which is animating Westminster today for reasons we will get into. But first, at 12:33, let's get the very latest LBC News headlines with Amelia Cox.
James O'Brien on LBC.
11:37. Just going to take in this story, which has been rumbling along, perhaps slightly unexpectedly, in Westminster of late, and especially today as well. This is regards to, of course, the serial killer Lucy Letby. She apparently, according to the chairman of a panel of international medical experts, has claimed did not murder any babies, they've claimed, while outlining significant new evidence. This is, of course, Letby, who's now 35, serving 15 whole life prison sentences after being convicted of murdering 7 babies and attempting to murder 7 others. And indeed, she's attracted support from some unlikely quarters from within Westminster itself, including the long-standing Conservative MP and former Tory leadership candidate, Brexit Secretary David Davis. LBC's political editor Natasha Clark has been at a press conference chaired by Mr. Davis, I think Sir David, in fact, now this morning. Slightly weird one, this, Natasha.
Yeah, it's a really, really interesting case that David Davis has been championing for quite a few months now, actually. And he's managed to get Dr. Shu Lee, who has flown 4,000 miles today to make this press conference in Westminster. He lives in Canada. He's a retired doctor, to make this major intervention, which essentially casts doubt on the guilt of Lucy Letby. And of course, she, like you just said, she's the nurse. She was convicted of killing 7 babies and attempting to murder even more at the Countess of Chester Hospital around the time of 2016. She's currently 34 years old, serving 15 whole life orders in prison at the moment. And at the time, it was considered to be one of the longest, most complex medical trials in England in modern times. And Dr. Lee's research was used by the prosecution at the time to argue that there had been a case to say that these babies had been injected with air, which had caused their deaths. But Dr. Lee disagrees, and he has convened a panel of 14 experts to look at the cases again and consider all of this evidence. Here's just a little bit of what he had to say just a few hours ago.
There was no medical evidence to support malfeasance causing death or injury in any of the 17 cases in the trial. Now, I've only presented you 7 of the cases, 7 of the 14 official convictions, but the others are similar. It's just nuances, changes of a variation in the details, all right? Death or injury of all the affected infants were due either to natural causes or to errors in medical care. There were serious problems related to medical care of patients at this hospital. There were problems related to teamwork and interdisciplinary collaboration at the Countess of Chester neonatal unit. In summary, ladies and gentlemen, we did not find any murders. In all cases, death or injury were due to natural causes or just bad medical care. Lucy was charged with 7 murders and 7 attempted murders. In our opinion, the medical evidence doesn't support murder in any of these babies, just natural causes and bad medical care. Our full report will go to Lucy's barrister later this month, and then it'll be up to him and the courts to decide what next to do.
So he went through the evidence from several of the babies involved in this case, spoke about the errors which he considered to be in their care, and released this 40-page dossier, which I've got in front of me, saying there was just not enough evidence to say that these babies had died due to injections of air or insulin. And he says that all of these babies were very sick already, that essentially there was poor care given by this hospital. And today's experts say that those babies died of natural causes, not murdered by Lucy Letby. So today their legal team, have launched a formal application to what's called the Criminal Cases Review Commission. So that's their last chance to overturn this legal verdict. The Court of Appeal has already thrown out 2 attempts to try and get this overturned, but she maintains her innocence despite all of the evidence to the contrary, despite a jury finding her guilty, despite there was this note that was used in the trial saying, "I did it, I killed these children, I am evil." But like you say, David Davis, the Tory MP, he has been really spearheading this. He has called this case today the biggest miscarriage of justice in modern times. And we know from the case of Andrew Mallockson that the state is capable sometimes of getting it wrong. But even just talking about this, incredibly controversial for politicians. Wes Streeting has been asked about this on LBC. He said that those calls to free her were crass and insensitive. And he did start today, Dr. Lee started today by saying he did have a lot of sympathy with those families. He's not looking to harm them, to try and talk about this case again. But we asked Lucy Letby's lawyer about how she was feeling about all this new evidence. He said that she does still have hope that her conviction can be overturned.
Because, as you say, I mean, I think I was the one who asked Wes Streeting about that. And he at the time, obviously this is towards the back end of the last year now, at the time, he was very emphatic about it. And the government have been very emphatic about it.
Yes,
they do not want to revisit it and do not think it ought to be revisited.
They do. And, this is obviously going through a public inquiry at the moment as well. Lady Justice Thirlwell, she's accused the critics who have been trying to talk about this of peddling conspiracy theories. And she's been incredibly strong, saying she doesn't want this case to be reopened at all. But like I say, now it's in the hands of the Criminal Justice Review Commission, who will look at specifics of this case. And they have said this morning they are looking at whether there is any case to reopen it. Incredibly controversial, but like I say, this is a team of experts, they say. So they're trying to say that there is new evidence today. I'd say it's probably not really new. It is looking again at the case.
And there's a huge online community that have, on Reddit and other types of places, which have taken it upon themselves to try and prove that she didn't do it.
Yeah,
so
absolutely. And David Davis today admitted that he was, convinced by this huge case that the New Yorker did, this 9,000-word essay that New Yorker wrote, which was actually banned from being seen in Britain at the time because of the appeals and the sort of she was trying to appeal the conviction at the time for contempt reasons. They blocked it from being seen in the UK. But he has said that he has gone through every single report of every single day of the trial of Lucy Letby and is convinced that he has seen as much evidence as he needs to be sure that this is a miscarriage of justice. And like you say, the case of Andrew Mallockson, there is of course cases where this does happen, but the families are very clear. They trust in the judgment of the jury that actually found her guilty. And actually I asked David Davis, well, does this actually give us a case to look again at whether juries should be involved in this kind of really detailed medical case? There's a lot of questions here, Lewis, and I think he said no. David Davis said no, that he didn't want to see that and just wanted to see the evidence be presented in a better way to these juries. But yeah, a lot of questions.
And what happens now? Nothing.
So essentially, there's no route of appeal. The Court of Appeal have rejected it twice, so it's going to go to this Criminal Justice Review Board. But even the experts today, Lucy Letby's lawyer, admitting that some of these cases have taken 7 years to be looked at. So we are absolutely nowhere near finishing hearing about the evidence of Lucy Letby for any time in the future. Obviously the Thirlwell inquiry into the state of the Countess of Chester Hospital and the general situation around Lucy Letby, that's still ongoing. We expect to hear back from them in the next sort of 6 months to a year. But what he's saying today, what David Davis is saying today, they are pointing very much the finger at the Countess of Chester Hospital in the case of these 17 babies.
Natasha Clark there, LBC political editor, who's been at that press conference chaired by Sir David Davis this morning. We're going to continue our conversation about Elon Musk and whether or not it is dangerous that he is accruing so much power of every type. 0345 6060 Listening to Lewis Goodall here on LBC. The time is just coming up to 12:45.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It's 12:47. A few of your texts on this question of Musk. Rob in Northampton says, America is on the brink, Lewis, of becoming the first superpower dictatorship. The UK needs to distance herself from these despots Neither Trump nor Musk are rational actors. As such, why would any rational actor do deals with them? Joseph says, yes, of course we should be worried about Musk, but whatever he's doing, because we don't really know what he is doing. If we assume he's performing some kind of root and branch change to how all of these US government departments work, presumably to save the taxpayer money on bureaucracy, and the qualification Musk has for doing this is he runs his own business and he's rich, this will end in widespread disaster. It is complete arrogance. But Calvin says, hi Lewis, you probably won't read this out because you don't understand the right or far right, but people are on about what Trump's saying is power mad and wants control. It is rubbish. He and Musk are doing what's right for his country, his people. What is wrong with that? Then look at this government. They want control and only over its own people. You think Trump and Musk is bad? This bungalow government, but no, that one, bungalow government we have is more frightening. Well, Calvin, you were wrong about one thing at least, weren't you? Because you said I'd never read it out, and I did. So 1-0 to me. Simon is in Edgware. Simon, your thoughts on Musk?
The gauntlet was thrown down, you had to respond.
Well, quite right, exactly.
I'll make it quick, I'm sure it's coming out to one. First of all, I think Musk is very much hyped with his projects. Most of his rockets are ended in disaster. His trucks have been all recalled because their engines are exploding with severe electrical faults. And as for the Tesla, I wouldn't drive one of those if you paid me. But onto your question
quite popular
about
cars,
whether...
though.
Onto your question about whether someone like that or anybody like that should have influence, absolutely not. It's extremely, especially someone as flawed as him. And in fact, if you remember, Dominic Cummings was the same sort of situation where he was dragged into the government by Johnson. Absolute power does corrupt, absolutely. And someone like him who hasn't been elected by the people, it's a very dangerous precedent. What could catapult him out the door is the fact that him and Trump are both extremely insecure, narcissistic, and have egos as large as the, should we say, the dome. What happens is if he starts to undermine Trump, which I suspect he may well do, then Trump will see that as a threat and get rid of him. But I'm totally opposed to people like this being brought into government with, no experience.
I suppose the problem is, Simon, is that it's absolutely, I mean, you know, there have been people who have been close allies of a leader, been brought into government many times across time and space. That is not unusual. I think what's unusual here is the fact that he is operating outside, both within and outside of the system at the same time. He doesn't have an official position. There's no one that can scrutinise him. It's not clear what he's doing and why, on whose authority.
Yeah, that's true. You're right in what you say in terms of other people have, because obviously all politicians have advisors, private advisors, but it's the access he's been given. This is the very dangerous part. He's got his own office in the Oval, the Oval, which is unprecedented. And yes, you're right. He could be sitting there doing things that no one knows what even Trump may not even be aware of. So I think it's while there's nothing wrong in having advisors, which of course all politicians do, who usually work on a private contractual basis, but it's the access to government legislation. That, for me, is dangerous. And for someone like that, who I consider to be utterly flawed, I would worry about it. In the same way I objected to Dominic Cummings being brought in with his weird and wonderful ideas that he had. And that's why I'm always opposed to the House of Law. That's why I want the House of Lords abolished and the second House set up with elected representatives. I'm very much opposed to that, having that kind of power in very small hands where you're unelected.
All right. Simon, grateful to you. Let's talk to Lee, who is in Melton Mowbray. Lee, your thoughts on this?
Good afternoon, Lewis.
Good afternoon.
Yes, well, I think the big problem with Musk is if you look at the history, you know, he made a lot of his fortune through PayPal, acquired Tesla, he then, set up SpaceX, all well and good initially. But I think the first sign was Ian Hislop was right a couple of weeks back, was when that chap went to try and rescue those children in that cave, and Musk wanted to get involved, and his response when he was told he wasn't needed was to call him pedo guy. That sent alarm bells ringing in my mind. Then he was going to acquire X. When he acquired X, after inflating the cost, the way that the employees were treated with absolute disdain. You know, people were really upset, and he just put laugh out loud. on his responses. How they work with on SpaceX. He turned up apparently on a Sunday night at 10 o'clock. There was only a couple of people there. Because of the way he is...
But he has been very successful, Lee, hasn't he? I mean, whatever we might think about the way he conducts himself, and he's not here. He's not here to defend himself, of course. But I mean, he has been extremely successful.
Oh, of course, and that's the thing is you can't deny that he's a great visionary when it comes to technology. Unfortunately, it's where it's descended into. When you look at how he started on X, he acquired it to provide free speech. What that invited was your likes of your Andrew Tate and the others to come back on, who obviously came very much to the fore. But it's a direction of travel with all of the support for all these various far-right groups, the AFD, Geert Wilders, and others, and the conspiracy theories that are coming through. You look at the California fires, the danger, the misinformation, the lies that were coming out of there. You know, Gavin Newsom is a great governor, but the attacks and the lies, the fact Gavin Newsom had to set up, people to counter that instead of trying to deal with the fires.
Okay. Lee, grateful to you. Just sum this up, I think, with actually talking about one of my favourite quotes from politics. Many of you will know it. And that is what you can call the reason this matters as a conversation is because it does it pass the Tony Benn test. And Tony Benn, whatever you think about him, obviously very famous left-winger, Labour cabinet minister, he had 5 essential questions about anyone in the democratic system that you have to be able to answer. I could do my Tony Benn impression, but I'm not going to. Number 1, what power have you got? Number 2, where did you get it from? Number 3, in whose interest do you exercise it? Number 4, to whom are you accountable? Number 5, how can we get rid of you? And Tony Benn said anyone who cannot answer those questions, particularly that last question, does not live in a democratic system. Only democracy gives us that right. That is why no one in power likes democracy, and that is why every generation must struggle to win it and keep it, including you and me, here and now. And for the life of me, when I think about those 5 questions, what, where, and whose interest, to whom are you accountable, and how can we get rid of you, I cannot answer those questions with regards to Elon Musk right now. We talked a little bit earlier, didn't we? Staying with American politics. I mentioned that Ronald Reagan clip, his last speech that he gave as president. It was a love letter to American immigration, and it is an amazing speech. And we thought we might just end the show today by listening to it and just think, is there any politician, never mind in the Republican Party, in America, in Britain, almost anywhere, who might speak like this now? This is Ronald Reagan.
And since this is the last speech that I will give as president, I think it's fitting to leave one final thought, an observation about a country which I love. It was stated best in a letter I received not long ago. A man wrote me and said, "You can go to live in France, but you cannot become a Frenchman. You can go to live in Germany or Turkey or Japan, but you cannot become a German, a Turk, or Japanese. But anyone from any corner of the earth can come to live in America and become an American." Yes, the torch of Lady Liberty symbolizes our freedom and represents our heritage, the compact with our parents, our grandparents, and our ancestors. It is that lady who gives us our great and special place in the world. For it's the great life force of each generation of new Americans that guarantees that America's triumph shall continue unsurpassed into the next century and beyond. Other countries may seek to compete with us, but in one vital area, as a beacon of freedom and opportunity that draws the people of the world, no country on earth comes close. This, I believe, is one of the most important sources of America's greatness. We lead the world because, unique among nations, we draw our people, our strength, from every country and every corner of the world. And by doing so, we continuously renew and enrich our nation. While other countries cling to the stale past, here in America, we breathe life into dreams, we create the future, and the world follows us into tomorrow. Thanks to each wave of new arrivals to this land of opportunity, we're a nation forever young, forever bursting with energy and new ideas, and always on the cutting edge, always leading the world to the next frontier. This quality is vital to our future as a nation. If we ever closed the door to new Americans, our leadership in the world would soon be lost. A number of years ago, an American student traveling in Europe took an East German ship across the Baltic Sea. One of the ship's crew members from East Germany, a man in his 60s, struck up a conversation with the American student. After a while, the student asked the man how he'd learned such good English, and the man explained that he had once lived in America. He said that for over a year he'd worked as a farmer in Oklahoma and California, that he'd planted tomatoes and picked ripe melons. It was, the man said, the happiest time of his life. Well, the student, who'd seen the awful conditions behind the Iron Curtain, blurted out the question, well, why did you ever leave? I had to, he said. The war ended. The man had been in America as a German prisoner of war. Now, I don't tell this story to make the case for former POWs. Instead, I tell this story just to remind you of the magical, intoxicating power of America. We may sometimes forget it, but others do not. Even a man from a country at war with the United States, while held here as a prisoner, could fall in love with us. Those who become American citizens love this country even more. And that's why the Statue of Liberty lifts her lamp to welcome them to the Golden Door. It is bold men and women yearning for freedom and opportunity who leave their homelands and come to a new country to start their lives over. They believe in the American dream, and over they make it come true for themselves, for their children, and for others. They give more than they receive, they labor and succeed, and often they are entrepreneurs. But their greatest contribution is more than economic, because they understand in a special way how glorious it is to be an American. They renew our pride and gratitude in the United States of America, the greatest, freest nation in the world, the last best hope of man on earth.
That was the 40th President of the United States of America, Ronald Reagan, speaking his last speech that he made as President. It was not for nothing that they called him the Great Communicator. What a long way we've travelled in all sorts of ways. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back on catch up on Global Player, where you can also pause and rewind live radio, and you can listen to that speech all over again, as well as listen to a range of podcasts, including, of course, the fact we're carrying on with the James O'Brien Daily whilst James is away. The best bits of this show in 60 minutes every day. Download now for free from your app store, or head to globalplayer.com. Maybe tomorrow I'll play a bit of Millard Fillmore or Teddy Roosevelt. Who knows? Coming up at 4.
Or Darren the Doorman from Reading.
That's right, coming up at 4.
That was a speech and a half.
But before that, coming up at 4 at LBC, it's Tom Swarbrick, but now it is time for another great communicator herself, Sheila Fogarty.
Thank you very much indeed.
James O'Brien on LBC.